These stories are from a 2003 collection entitled COSMOS Latinos, an anthology of science fiction from Latin America and Spain. Brief introductions to each story written by the editors Andrea L. Bell and Yolanda Molina Gavilan will also be read. Time markers for each are provided in a pinned comment below. The anthology comprises work written between the years 1862 and 2001. For the purpose of keeping to this channel's theme, I've chosen my personal favorites written prior to the 1990s. For only one of the included authors could a photo not be found, and so the book's cover will reappear in this case. Read by Daryl T. Smith II for my channel, Quasar Spectra. Introduction to The Death Star by Ernesto Silva Roman. Written in 1929, translated by Andrea Bell and Cassandra Griffith. Ernesto Silva Roman, 1897 to 1977, the Jules Verne of Chilean letters, as he has been called, was an active writer throughout much of his long life. He devoted himself chiefly to journalism, working as a reporter and editor, and eventually founding several newspapers. At the peak of his career, the political articles he wrote under the pseudonym The Black Chancellor for El Mercurio, Chile's preeminent newspaper, appeared in over 40 periodicals throughout the country. In addition to journalism, Silva Roman was a senator, a presidential press secretary, and Secretary General of Chile's national airline. Silva Roman also authored a historically significant body of fiction of a type rarely seen in Chile then, science fiction stories that echoed the space adventures being popularized in U.S. and European pulps, and which were not wholly unknown to Latin American readers. These works constituted an important step in the development of Chilean SF. The Death Star is a perfect example of Silva Roman's style. It is taken from The Master of the Stars, 1929, a slim volume of 7 SF stories, most of them explicitly set in Chile. The tales are full of scientists, both virtuous and vile, elitist supreme councils, amazing new technologies, paranormal forces, and archetypal power struggles. Science serves a less exclusively sociological, political, or moral function in this author's works than it does for other regional SF pioneers. Nevertheless, faith in a scientific meritocracy comes through as the ideological underpinning of the anthology. What is expected of the general populace is obedience, devotion, and self-sacrifice. The Death Star is quintessential Silva Roman, showcasing the author's themes and his penchant for gadgetry and high drama. Over 70 years later, it is still an absorbing read. The Death Star. On January 3rd, 2035, the first symptom came into being. At 2 o'clock that morning, the saturation wave began to take form. It was like a powerful, energetic new life force that penetrated all living things without warning. It caused neither surprise nor disquiet in the public mind. Its very advance, slight, almost imperceptible, ubiquitous, went unperceived by all. Nevertheless, that morning the extraordinary forces that threw humanity into turmoil and almost completely annihilated it through an excess of vital radiation began to take shape. The astronomers in Aconcagua and the Himalayas were the first to register the birth, out in space, of a new planet. It was like a sudden concentration of immense, colossal nebulae, an instantaneous act of creation that took place almost directly above the observatories of our most eminent scientists. Only much later would the secrets of that mysterious star be unraveled. The astronomer Auriel Ristal, an active member of the Supreme Council of Human Management, was able to demonstrate clearly that there was no such thing as spontaneous creation or the sudden concentration of cosmic energies in the vast reaches of outer space. It was merely a rogue star, hurled at a terrifying speed into the unfathomable and unimagined depths of the endless heavens. No, it was not exactly a comet, nor was it a giant meteor. It was simply a planet that, free of restraints and systems, and perhaps obeying who knows what strange and mysterious plan, had burst onto the visual or explorable range of the planetary system for the first time. According to Ristal's calculations, mathematical and precise in time and in space, the traveling star, whose volume was 500 million times greater than Earth's, would take 18 months and 18 days to approach and then pass by us, before quickly vanishing out beyond the last star. Its unexpected presence in the visual field of the most powerful terrestrial observatories was due exclusively to unknown problems of radioactivity or luminosity. Auriel Ristal assumed the extraordinary star was composed of chemical compounds and substances unfamiliar to terrestrials, and that these strange ingredients were the reason for the lack of visibility of the star's first babblings at the edges of our astral domain. At the same time, he predicted likely changes and influences upon the Earth because of radiations from that unknown star. His predictions and speculations caused quite a stir. In those days, the ignorant public had ceased laughing at and ridiculing men of science. Through painful and tragic experience, they knew that the strangest and the most unexpected is what occurs with the greatest ease. Journalists published long, inflated accounts. They skillfully exploited their readers' anxieties. Moreover, scientists set about formulating the most diverse hypotheses. In spite of everything, no one suspected what was really in store. The days passed by. Weeks. Months. The solitary star appeared not to move in space. To the naked eye, it looked like one more star, one growing in volume and intensity, day by day. Only the astronomers knew that the gigantic planet, that frightful star, was hurtling toward the Earth at a speed of 1 light year per second. The tension of those first days gradually subsided. Within a few weeks, nobody paid the least attention to that small luminous point that remained fixed and unchanging out beyond the sun. The Universal Medical Society tried in vain to conceal the research of the distinguished biologist Dasrael Morales. Even though humanity's sense of wonder was sluggish and relative, that man's scientific claims caused a sensation. For some months now, humans had been growing at an alarming rate. At first they believed it heralded the betterment of the races, but later they saw that even the most degenerate ones rapidly flourished. Humans were already, without exception, 2 meters high, and their weight never fell below 100 kilos. It was useless trying to lose weight or retard one's physical development. People were growing, and growing. Where would this unexpected growth end? And then it was that Dasrael Morales dumbfounded humanity with his astonishing discovery. Humans were growing and developing as were trees, crops, and animals, that is, as were all organic bodies, because vitamin D was affecting living things in a decisive and uncompromising way. Morales had succeeded in discovering this. He had been observing it for months. And with each observation, vitamin D's power and radioactivity were greater. Up against the shrewdness of that biologist who had achieved so much glory for his homeland, the mystery could not remain unsolved much longer. It was inescapable, it was undeniable, that all this abrupt and unexpected flourishing of vitamin D was due to the increasing proximity of the unknown star, of that planet which had appeared suddenly from the depths of the heavens and which now enveloped the earth with emanations as formidable as they were impossible to define. Once his report had been presented to the medical society, and after having verbally expounded his discovery before the Council of 500, Dasrael Morales took off in his private gyroplane and left for some secret destination. 2 hours later, he was in conference with the astronomer Auriel Ristal. According to Ristal's calculations, the mystery planet would take exactly 6 months to pass by the Earth. These 6 months, added to the year and 17 days its trajectory had taken till now, made for a total of 564 days and 12 hours. Its return to the depths of nothingness would require an equal number of days. Morales now had a precise point upon which to base his theoretical scale. Once again, he submerged himself in calculations and experiments, and when he had everything ready, he sent a mental message to the Supreme Council of Humanity, letting them know he had mastered the enigma and was in a position to draw an exact picture of what would happen to the Earth until that time when all danger had passed and the solar system returned to a state of tranquility. A murmur of approval greeted the chief of the 500's words. Dasrael Morales moved forward to occupy the podium. Gentlemen, humanity finds itself facing a fearful danger, and it is necessary that this esteemed council take immediate stock of the situation in order to avoid the death or extinction of the planet. At this very moment, the lost star is exerting its influence over the Earth, unleashing upon vitamins a stupendous amount of radioactivity, an amount growing and increasing by the second. Instead of robbing vitamins of the natural function that the harmonic forces of nature assigned them, it has given life, that is to say, given fantastic vitality and robustness, to vitamin D, which is the one that determines the development of the individual and of organic bodies. To vitamin D is owed the fact that we all now measure over 2 meters in height. I have made precise calculations that have led to the horror of a monstrous chart. If an individual keeps growing in direct relation to the nearness of the mysterious planet, he will reach a height of 115 meters, 73 centimeters. We must remember that, along with mankind, the animals, trees, and fishes will grow. Everything, absolutely everything. The oceans will overflow their beds. They will not be able to contain such immense creatures as 300-meter-long sharks and 2,200-meter-long whales. Earth itself will not have room for 1.9 billion men and women who each measure 115 meters high by 40 meters wide. It will be a disaster. Death, the greatest abomination. Forests will reach unbelievable dimensions. Trees will grow to fantastic heights. The animals themselves will be so shockingly large they will take up 2/3 of the earth. What will become of humanity in those terrible days? As the Death Star moves further away, vitamin D will slowly lose its strength and its tremendous radioactivity. Humans will gradually decrease in size until everything returns to normal once our strange visitor has disappeared forever. But will anyone be left alive after the catastrophe? Will anything be left? And now we come to what I propose to the Supreme Council. We must construct, in under 96 hours, a huge underground shelter able to withstand anything. Specifically, it must be able to withstand the horrific pressures that will arise during the days of fear, and the most useful members of humanity, along with their families, must take refuge there. Once enclosed therein, we will put ourselves into a deep, hypnotic sleep, which will end once the forces of the planet that threatens us have disappeared. Then we will emerge and see if anything is still alive. Vitamin D is a photosynthetic element created by the action of light upon cholesterol. I am in possession of a chemical compound that suspends and stops the karyokinesis of cellular elements and limits, though only for a very short while, generative activity. A triple graduated injection will immunize us for a few days, not more than 4. Therefore, we must take advantage of those days while the absorption of radiations that act directly upon cholesterol lasts. 3 days later, on precisely the 6th of January 2035, the last steel door was shut. 3,292 human beings were thus completely cut off from humanity, buried alive in a spacious underground shelter carved out at a depth of 200 meters. Colossal concrete walls blocked up the last hydraulic hatches. Everyone was immediately put into a deep cataleptic sleep. Dasrael Morales was the last one to adopt the life-saving measure. For many days, for long and exhausting weeks, he monitored the frightening process of human growth, until one day, the diabolical monsters that roamed the earth smashed all the television installations to pieces. Then everything came to an end for the Watcher. He retired to his chamber and hypnotized himself. Only a few months remained until the awakening. Introduction to Baby HP by Juan José Arriola. Written in 1952, translated by Andrea Bell. Juan José Arriola, 1918 to 2001, is considered by many scholars of Mexican letters to be one of the most influential prose stylists of his generation. An autodidact whose formal schooling was interrupted by the Cristero Wars, he became a voracious reader while apprenticed to a bookbinder. He later trained as an actor and developed a lifelong passion for the art and craft of the spoken word. He began publishing in the early 1940s and over the course of some 20 years produced the witty and often unclassifiable short prose pieces, stories, sketches, fables, epigrams, even a bestiary, which so astonished the literary public of his day and for which he is still justifiably celebrated. Readers wishing to acquaint themselves with Arriola's stylistic inventiveness, fertile imagination, and irreverent, sophisticated use of language would do well to peruse his collection of fables, Confabulario, 1941 to 1961, generally thought to contain his best work. The Switchman is Arriola's most frequently anthologized piece of fantastic literature. We have therefore selected something less well-known, Baby HP. With this text, Arriola joins the tradition of satirical writers such as Lucian of Samosata, Francisco de Quevedo, Cyrano de Bergerac, Edgar Allan Poe, and Jonathan Swift. In fact, readers familiar with Swift's famous 1729 essay, A Modest Proposal for Preventing the Children of Poor People in Ireland from Being a Burden to Their Parents or Country and for Making Them Beneficial to the Public, will surely enjoy Arriola's playful, science-fictional, and intertextual treatment of the theme, and his sarcastic indictment of modern technology. Baby HP. To the lady of the house, convert your children's vitality into a source of power. Introducing the marvelous Baby HP, a device that will revolutionize home economics. The baby HP is a very strong and lightweight metal structure that adapts perfectly to an infant's delicate body by means of comfortable belts, wrist straps, rings, and pins. The attachments on this supplementary skeleton capture every one of the child's movements, collecting them in a small Leyden jar that can be fastened as needed to the infant's back or chest. A needle indicates when the jar is full. Then, madame, simply detach the jar and plug it into a special receptacle into which it automatically discharges its contents. This container can then be stored in any corner of the house and represents a precious supply of electricity that can be used at any time for the purpose of light and heat, or to run any of the innumerable appliances that now and forever invade our homes. From this day forward, you will look upon your children's exhausting running about with new eyes. No longer will you lose patience when your little one flies into a rage, for you shall see it as a generous source of energy. Thanks to Baby HP, a nursing infant's round-the-clock tantrum is transformed into a few useful seconds running the blender or into 15 minutes of radiophonic music. Large families can meet their electricity needs by outfitting each of their progeny with a baby HP and can even start up a small and profitable business, supplying their neighbors with some of the surplus energy. Big apartment high-rises can satisfactorily cover lapses in public service by linking together all of the family's energy receptacles. The baby HP causes no physical or psychological trauma in children because it neither inhibits nor alters their movements. On the contrary, some doctors believe it contributes to the body's wholesome development. And as for the spirit, you can foster individual ambition in the wee ones by rewarding them with little prizes when they surpass their usual production records. For this purpose, we recommend sugar treats, which repay your investment with interest. The more calories added to a child's diet, the more kilowatts saved on the electricity bill. Children should wear their lucrative baby HPs day and night. It is important that they always wear them to school so as not to lose out on the valuable hours of recess, from which they return with their storage tanks overflowing with energy. Those rumors claiming that some children are electrocuted by the very current they generate are completely irresponsible. The same can be said of the superstitious fear that youngsters outfitted with a baby HP attract lightning bolts and emit sparks. No accident of this type can occur, especially if the instructions that accompany each device are followed to the letter. The Baby HP is available in fine stores in a range of sizes, models, and prices. It is a modern, durable, trustworthy device, and all of its parts are extendable. Its manufacture is guaranteed by the J.P. Mansfield & Sons Company of Atlanta 3. The Crystal Goblet by Geronimo Montero. Written 1964, translated by Roberta Rosende and David Sunderland. Sometimes known by the pseudonyms Ronnie Wells, J. Jeremias, and Gilgamesh, Geronimo Montero, 1908 to 1970, was Brazil's first serious cultivator of SF. He was born in Sao Paulo to working-class parents and had to leave school at the age of 10 in order to help out the family. After a series of manual and office jobs, Montero discovered a passion for reading and by age 20 had published his first short stories. Although his literary work includes magazine essays and newspaper articles, he is most remembered for his radio SF detective stories, later issued in print, featuring the character Dick Peter, and for his numerous SF novels and stories, many of them for young readers. An avid fan of popular fiction, he also founded Brazil's first science fiction fan club and edited a few issues of the magazine De Ficção Científica, the local version of fantasy and science fiction. With The Crystal Goblet, written in 1964 and first published in Tangents of Reality in 1969, Montero joins the many SF authors who have centered on the fear of nuclear war, yet this story is told in a manner that makes it distinctive. As Montero focuses on the visions and memories triggered by a crystal goblet, the reader not only gets an intimate glimpse of the Brazilian protagonist's life, but is also made to reflect on humanity's capacity for cruelty and self-destruction. The Crystal Goblet. The goblet, the leather strap, the jail. Miguel was holding the broken-stemmed goblet between his fingers. He was looking at it intensely, certain that it represented a very important connection to the past. What was it? What connection could it have? The goblet of fine crystal was worth nothing broken like that. It couldn't even be made to stand up. How had the shaft been before, when the goblet was new? Long? Short? And why had he kept this goblet for so many years? Why had he found it just now in the old junk closet? He let go of the goblet, which rocked slowly from side to side on the tabletop, and without knowing by what strange association the violence he had recently experienced came back to mind, almost painfully. The soldiers, machine guns in hand, surrounding him in the street at dusk when he was leaving to visit the mayor. "Communist, you're under arrest!" He was shoved into the van, where 3 of his colleagues already were sitting, along with 2 more soldiers with machine guns across their knees. They drove toward the center of the small city, the killer sergeant asking where so-and-so lived. New stops, more people inside the already crowded van. "Communists! Communists!" Confinement in the small cement cell, damp and cold. Later, back in the van, the road, and the DOPS prison, full of men, communists, cement floor, no bench, no mattress, hundreds of men lying on the floor, and others walking carefully between the bodies so as not to step on them. The majority were half naked, since the heat was unbearable in the huge, unventilated room. The toilet seat in the corner, exposed to everyone. The endless hours lived in anguish because of the lack of air, the smell, and the indignity. Later on, the review panel. "There's nothing against you, sir. You're free to go. You were jailed on false charges. Don't take it hard. You know it happens in times like these." The heavy soul, the abused body, the brain deranged by frustration, humiliation crushing one's humanity. Miguel again picked up the broken stem, looking at it through the painful fog of his imagination. Right now, the goblet reminded him of the strap, a leather strap 3 feet in length, dark and shiny. The leather strap that used to hang by one end from the nail in the kitchen door jamb, the one his father used to lash him with. Sometimes, after the beating, his mother would put him inside the tank with pickling brine to wash his welt and slash-covered body. But the goblet... Little by little, memory connected the untied links, and he remembered the scene that had been buried and forgotten for half a century now. A small strip of land on the banks of the Tamanduatay River between João Teodoro and São Caetano streets, shrubs growing everywhere, piles of debris here and there, old basins, broken buckets, parts of chairs, fragments of mirrors, battered pans. A magic kingdom in the eyes of Miguelzinho. Whenever he could escape constant supervision, he went there to discover treasures, like that big iron basin the neighborhood families used for their weekly bath. It was punctured and crumpled, but it was his most cherished toy, propped up on one side by a pole like a trap. It was his cave. He spent forgotten hours there, just dreaming. One afternoon, while in his cave, he saw the crystal goblet shining in the middle of the bushes, clear, bright. A precious treasure in that place of sadness, filled with cans and ugly bits of glass. Before picking it up, he stared at it, amazed. Later, he held it carefully between his fingers, as it seemed it might break into pieces, so fragile and delicate was it. 50 years later, Miguel didn't necessarily remember what little Miguelzinho did, saw, or thought about under the old basin on that strip of land, with the goblet in his hand. But he remembered well that the boy had noticed, suddenly, that hours had passed. It was late. If he arrived home after his father got back from work, he wouldn't escape the strap. The chief and indisputable point of his discipline was that he had to be inside by the time his father got home. Almost fainting, he crawled out from under the basin. He had no choice but to go home, no matter what was waiting for him. He confusedly thought that if he brought him that gorgeous crystal goblet, his father might forgive him, realizing that there was perhaps an explanation for his tardiness. Besides, his body still ached from the last beating. The goblet was of no use at all. His father beat him. He was forced to swallow supper, though he had no appetite, and then went sobbing quietly to his bed, which was set up in the living room under the window facing the village. The house had a living room, a bedroom, and a kitchen. After supper, his father would sit near the front door, and his mother would be in the kitchen doing the interminable housework. By 9 p.m., they would be in bed. It was another incontestable point of household discipline. Miguelzinho couldn't sleep. He'd stopped crying. He pulled the blanket off his head and contemplated the darkness. That was why he noticed a soft bluish light in the kitchen outside the door. For some time he looked at it, curiosity growing. What could it be? Is the kerosene light on? Some other night light? Or are there still lighted coals in the stove? But it was a bluish light. It wasn't the moonlight. The kitchen didn't have a window. Miguelzinho stood up, stifling his moans, trying not to make any noise, but his father's voice came from across the room. "Where are you going?" "To get a drink of water, may I?" As there was no reply, it meant he could go. He walked toward the kitchen, and from the door the light dazzled him. The blue glow of the crystal goblet overturned on the small table by the sink. It seemed full of light. Pale shadows imprisoned inside it moved about in confusion like smoke scrolls. Amazed by that wondrous sight, the boy froze like a statue, gazing without understanding. The kitchen didn't have a ceiling. There were some broken tiles in the roof, and through the holes it was possible to see the faint light of the moonlit sky. A star was shining right in the center of the triangle of a broken roofing tile. Suddenly his father's voice thundered from the living room. "What are you up to? Does it take such a long time to drink water?" Miguelzinho took a sip. "I'm finished. I'm coming." He grabbed the goblet and walked toward the door. As soon as he picked up the glass from the top of the small table, the enchantment vanished. There was no more blue glow. All he had in his hand was a crystal goblet, broken. He went back to bed with his treasure, fondling it in the dark. When he was about to fall asleep, he placed it carefully on the ground next to the wall. Now, as Miguel was looking at the goblet, thoughts and bits of imagination and casual observation intermingled in his memory. The glass, full of images from his childhood on the banks of the Tamanduaite River, was of a pure crystal, finer and clearer than he had ever seen before. He hadn't noticed that back when he had found it in the trash on the strip of land. He had noticed that it was white, transparent, pretty, much prettier than any glass he'd ever seen, very different from the thick glass cup they had in his house, greenish, rough, with small white bubbles. The glass used to serve water to guests. The only one, because glasses weren't used in his house. They used white tin cups and condensed milk cans to which traveling tinsmiths welded handles. Those tinkers who roamed the streets, proclaiming their presence through black notes made by a small hammer striking an iron skillet. Now, however, he could distinguish quality crystal from inferior glass. The goblet with the broken stem was of very fine crystal. Broken stem. Now that Miguel examined the goblet more closely, he realized that the stem wasn't broken. That goblet had never had the round base that all stemmed glasses have. The stem was perfectly finished. It had, at the very end, a small, cone-shaped indentation. Miguel tried to stand it on end. For a moment it didn't move, but suddenly it twisted, rolled along the table, and fell to the ground, despite Miguel's efforts to stop it. His heart froze, as if the goblet's breaking into pieces would cause him irreparable harm. But it did not break. It bounced on the tile floor, emitting crystalline sounds, shook from side to side, and came to rest under Miguel's disbelieving stare. Miguel didn't pick it up right away. For some time he stared at it. It just couldn't be, but nevertheless it was true. The goblet was unscathed, intact, as perfect and pure as before. With the goblet between his fingers, he examined it again carefully. Nothing. Some rare stroke of luck prevented the goblet from shattering against the ceramic floor. Or could it be unbreakable? He held the tip of its stem between two fingers and struck it with a pencil. The Argentine sound filled the office and diffused into waves. Another blow, stronger, another wave of sound, broader, more expansive. He picked up the scissors and, after a little hesitation, bit the cup forcefully. The silvery note sounded throughout the entire house, and the crystal goblet remained intact, vibrating between his fingers. Excited, he placed the goblet on the desk and left for the terrace. A cool wind was blowing from the sea. The weather vane on top of the long cedar pole, Grandpa's airplane, as big children used to call it, was turning quietly, slowly rotating between south and east. 200 meters from the end of the street, the waves rose in a foamy crest. 2 fishing boats were slowly passing on the horizon. One more house was being built on that street. When they had come to Mongagua, their house was the first, and for a long time the only one around. The solitude was pleasant. Birds of numerous species abounded. When the sun went down, thrushes sang in the nearby trees. From time to time, flocks of small parrots passed overhead, flying high and crying out, headed for the nearest mountain. Herons descended in laden flight when heavy rains made lagoons of the land. White-throated rails jumped and chirped, and other water birds frequented the puddles as well. Later on, they started to build other houses. Boys with slingshots walked through the newly cleared land. Men clenching rifles dedicated themselves to the hunt. Now over a year had gone by without birds, not even tanagers, which had been so abundant. It was rare to hear a thrush singing. Later came the van, the policemen with machine guns. "Communist, you're under arrest!" And the jail, the bodies covering the floor, the toilet seat open for all to see. Like death, the escape of the birds. A dark and ugly stain extended itself over the house and the landscape, flowing from the subjugated spirit, a stain that spread and covered the small city, the coast, the state, and the country. Like the headstone of a tomb, inside the tomb you cannot speak, nor hear, nor think. Inside the tomb the body lies dead, the toilet seat in the corner, the one who sat on it, in front of hundreds of other men, cowed, subdued. It was like that. The toilet seat, everyone looking. Lying in the hammock, on the terrace, Miguel let his spirit wander without direction, flying like a bird over land transformed by fire into desert. No place to settle that wouldn't wound, burn, or sully it, but somehow the tired spirit could still fall asleep in the sun. The goblet, the ducks, the jail. At night, after supper, Miguel again held the crystal goblet between his fingers and was strangely worried by empty and shapeless thoughts. The goblet, it seems, was forcefully demanding his attention, more his whole being. It was the glass. When, while still a little boy, he'd first seen that blue inner glow filling the humble tile-roofed kitchen, had he really seen it? Could it have been one of those jokes that memory, mixing imagination and the needs of the moment, plays on us? Wouldn't it be, then, a deceit of the spirit? Something like a psychic spectacle staged by him, unconsciously, in order to soften the painful memories of infancy? He thought of telling his wife the history of the crystal goblet, but he soon grew discouraged. How should he tell her? How should he answer questions that would open unexpected shortcuts in his memory or along the pathway of his ideas? People want to know more this and more that. Sometimes they want to know things that cannot be explained. But if the goblet was luminous at night, the trick was to prove it. He closed the blinds of the office, shut the door, turned off the lights, and placed the goblet upside down on the desk. Nothing. It was there, lightly visible because the darkness was incomplete, but there was no glow inside. Perhaps he needed to wait, give it time. That night, in the tile-roofed kitchen, half a century ago, the goblet had been on the small table an hour or two before he'd removed the blanket from his head and seen the glow. So he left it on the desk, upside down, and went out onto the terrace. His wife, Carr, was in the hammock, and she spoke to him of relaxing things, of hens, ducks, and teals. "Somebody's touched the teal's nest. She abandoned it. She's laying her eggs anywhere, any place. Mr. Alipio found an egg yesterday close to the brick pile. Today I found another one on the banks of the stream. She'll end up choosing another place to make her nest. Tomorrow I'll kick another duck. We still have 3 males and just 2 females. We only have to leave 1 male." "Sure, 1 male is enough. Do you want me to make duck steaks?" "Excellent. Whatever you make is great." Teals, male ducks, female ducks, steaks, and the crystal goblet upside down, back in the office, in the dark. Today, when I went to the village, I saw the German guy talking with Mr. Zay. I was crazy with hate. He knows very well who made the denunciation. What you think is really the truth. Of course it is. He's friends with the accuser. It was a setup. He was imprisoned together with the others to eavesdrop on them. Traitor. How disgusting. I wanted to slap him in the face. Don't worry, Carr. Men are like that. Men are like that. Perverse, cruel, like the wolf when it sees the 3 little pigs defenseless. The man who suddenly sees himself with a little power in his hands tries immediately to assemble a guillotine, a gallows, and a coffin. Now those people will see who they're dealing with. And the van, the machine guns, the killer sergeant. "Communist, you're under arrest." And the crystal goblet back there in the darkness, upside down. Miguel left the pleasant shade of the terrace and went back into the office. It was true. There was a bluish light inside the goblet, but very weak. So weak, it wouldn't even illuminate the hand he held up to it. Was that really it? That same radiating glow from the old tile-roofed kitchen half a century ago? To what degree could his memory be trusted? To what extent had his imagination embellished, created subterfuges, screens, and labyrinths? What masterpiece could the mind's defenses construct to hide from consciousness the fissures, the cracks, the charred wooden stumps of the scorched field? Perhaps more time was needed. He went back to the terrace. Carr had fallen asleep in the hammock. Brave woman. When he'd been able to send her the message from jail, she had received the news calmly. She'd spent the entire night here, sitting on the terrace waiting for the sun to rise in order to do the right thing. If he hadn't slept on the cement floor of the jail, she wouldn't sleep either. Who knows who ached more, she from the hammock's fabric, or he from the hard cement with the cockroaches running back and forth. At dawn, she left and headed toward the city, but she wanted to pass unnoticed. Who knew what they would dream up if there was any surveillance? She walked some kilometers along the railroad tracks, stumbling, falling in the darkness surrounding the sunrise. She took the 5 o'clock train at the next station. In the city, she looked for those of her friends who could intercede on his behalf. That was all in the past now. There she was, sleeping calmly in the darkness of the terrace. Everything over. She was asleep. But for him, would everything also be over? Would he be able someday to cleanse his defiled dignity? Miguel tried to sleep on the other hammock with little success. As it had 50 years ago, the crystal goblet kept him awake, looking at it. When their son came back from the movies at 10:30, they went to bed. Carr was sleeping heavily. She could fall asleep by just putting her head on the pillow and wouldn't awaken easily. Miguel could wake up, walk around, turn the lights on and off without disturbing her. The bluish light. In the office, everything was the same. The glow inside the crystal goblet was the same as hours before, but it existed, no doubt. Who knows, maybe the setting wasn't right. Maybe the conditions didn't match the ones in the old kitchen with the tile roof, the broken pieces of roofing tile, a star shining through one of the holes. He thought about the storeroom at the back of the hall, totally dark, the small window facing west. He took the goblet and placed it on the ironing board, observing it, anxious. No doubt now it was brighter inside, but it wasn't the radiant glow of 50 years ago, not by a long shot. He looked at the dark night through the window. Few stars were shining. This was the less populated part of the sky. The Milky Way was more toward the east, over the house. He remembered then the large shed in the yard. He could punch a hole in the roof. He went to the shed. He placed the goblet on the carpenter's bench. With the chisel, he opened a small hole in the roof. Later on, he would fix that. He closed the doors, and the darkness folded around him like the wings of a bat. Soon he could make out, in the darkness, the blue light imprisoned in the crystal goblet. Miguel's heart beat rapidly. He felt he was back in the old kitchen. He went back 50 years. He changed the position of the goblet slightly, and the glow grew visibly brighter. Slowly, he moved it around, observing the alterations of the light, until, finding what seemed to be the ideal position, the shed was faintly illuminated by the blue incandescence. Miguel felt so moved that he sat down and decided to be quiet for some time, with his eyes shut, immobile. What was that? He didn't know. He didn't know which force or phenomenon would be at work, but it was, without a doubt, something extraordinary, something the physical, chemical, and optical laws of his understanding didn't seem to explain. But it was also very difficult to explain that goblet of fine crystal with no bottom, unbreakable. He opened his eyes again. He drew the old chair nearer the carpenter's bench to be more comfortable, his eyes level with the crystal goblet. He could see that the blue glow didn't keep still. It fluttered, throbbed, and described scrolls and spirals that faded continuously into new waves and strange forms. It was astonishing and paralyzing, as if from that strange light a hypnotic force somehow emanated. As time passed, it seemed not only did he immerse his gaze in the delicate, undulating bluish light, but also his head, his entire body, as if the small goblet engulfed all the space before him. There was nothing, neither the carpenter's bench nor the shed, only the glow, with its abstract dark forms, intertwining, rising up, and falling. The blast of a horn brought him back to reality. After that, the violent clamor of the train racing alongside the house ruined the silence and the calm. Miguel withdrew from the blue light and realized, with some astonishment, that it was 5 o'clock in the morning. The sun would be rising in a little while. He had spent the entire night looking at that false reality that surged from deep in his past. He kept looking. The phenomenon continued, but it seemed to be weaker. He got up, stretched his legs, opened the doors, and looked out at the fresh, grayish dawn. He went back to the goblet. Its light had almost gone out. Sighing deeply, he placed it carefully on the shelf near the packets of nails. He closed the shed door and went off to bed. What lived inside the goblet? Miguel woke up late and had great difficulty getting back to work. It was hard for him to find the words for the daily section he wrote for the newspaper. Things weren't falling into place. His spirit was distant, ill at ease, empty. He was waiting anxiously for night to come and had to invent excuses in order to calm his wife, who noticed his agitation. What a childish way to spend the entire night, gazing at a crystal goblet. It was such a personal thing, so intimate, so close to that childhood when Miguelzino dreamed beneath the great basin on that strip of land, that it seemed impossible someone else could become interested in the goblet or see what he saw inside it. When night fell, Miguel went back to the shed, his soul full of doubts. Would that bluish light still be shining one more time? Yes, there it was, like the previous night, like 50 years ago in that old kitchen, so poor and full of holes. He pulled up the chair and sat down looking at it. The diaphanous shadows inside the blue light waved slowly. It was fascinating and hypnotic. He was distracted from his immersion in the mystery by a quietly approaching form. It was Carr. She saw his astonished face in the blue glow of the goblet. She smiled. In a certain way, the enchantment was broken. The luminescence was there. The dark, undulating shapes continued moving slowly, but the privacy was disturbed. The mystic magic had vanished. "What's this?" she asked, her eyes wide. "I don't know. What do you think?" "It looks like witchcraft. What's inside that goblet?" "Nothing." Miguel picked up the goblet and turned on the light. She took it, dazzled, turning it around in her hand. Later, the lights turned back off, the goblet back in its place. Miguel said more. "I've had this goblet for more than 50 years. I found it on a strip of land when I was still a child. Back then, it already had this light inside it, at night. Later on, I forgot about it. Yesterday, I accidentally found it again, and everything came back to me. I was trying, but this light, what is it?" "Well, who knows? That's what I'm trying to find out. It has to be something. The glass isn't common either. It seems to be made of crystal, but it doesn't break. How odd." Carr pulled up a box, sat down, and stared at the goblet, as fascinated as he was. For some minutes the two contemplated the spectacle in silence. Later she said, "Some things are moving inside." "That's right. Those dark shadows are wonderful." "Do you only see dark shadows?" "Just dark shapes. Shadows that ripple up and down." "No, Miguel, they're not shadows. Wait, they're things. It looks like an army marching over an immense land." "An army?" "Yes, men. Lots of men. Other things, too. I don't know. Things that slide? Carts. Look, can't you see?" He did not see. He saw dark shadows in motion. He saw variations in tone, moving to one side and disappearing, while other shadows advanced in procession. Everything was disorganized. Carr must be blessed with rare visual acuity to be able to distinguish exact forms, where he just saw a vague outline. But she'd always been abnormally sensitive to many things, and now there she was, leaning over the crystal goblet, mesmerized by its translucent, elusive essence, even more alienated from the world that surrounded her than she'd ever been, with all her passion for this strange wonder. Army. Marching men. Carts. They spent the entire night immersed in the luminous world of the crystal goblet, she seeing throngs of human beings walking over an endless land, scattered among heavy war vehicles. She saw the brightness of weapons, the tips of spears, the reflection of light from the blades of drawn swords. She saw clouds of dust billowing over the soldiers. He saw only dark forms of capricious movement, and let himself be fascinated by them, even while, in his bemusement, he could hear the excited description that Carr made of the scenes. The shapes he saw matched what she was describing. It was as if, being tremendously nearsighted, as he really was, he were watching a movie without glasses. Later on, he thought that perhaps using sufficiently strong eyeglasses might have let him see things better. He was thinking about this when the whistle of the 5 o'clock train suddenly announced it was time to shut down the show. The anxiety of the wait repeated itself the following day. Now their waiting generated conversation. They swapped hypotheses, and somehow it helped pass the time. Work could wait. It was impossible to work under such excitement. Miguel went to Santos, bought some eyeglasses, and at night, in the shed, put them to the test, only to quickly learn they didn't work. With or without eyeglasses, everything for him was dark shadows. Carr, however, continued to clearly distinguish the scenes that unfolded inside the blue light. They've stopped on a great plain. Some are moving from one side to another. Far on the horizon, a dark spot is moving. Now they're lighting big fires. Miguel could see the fires, not as fires, but as luminous points, more alive and reddish in the blue tonality. 8 fires? He asked. 8 already lit, but they're lighting more all over. Can you see now? I see the brightness of the fires. How are they armed? Do they have rifles, machine guns, and cannons? No, they don't seem to have any firearms. They have spears, swords, and shields. Damn! How about that spot over there? It looks like they're approaching, very slowly. He saw this. A darker shape coming from the extreme edge of the blue light, descending toward the center. For some time they watched in silence. Later, she said excitedly, "It's another army. It's coming toward this one. Looks like there'll be a battle." Sure enough, the two armies finally met in a tremendous, chaotic clash. Miguel saw the shadows mixing together, interpenetrating. Carr, however, could see details. "It's horrible. They're destroying each other like beasts. They're cutting each other to ribbons with swords, skewering each other with spears. They're in pieces. Blood's gushing everywhere. The ones who are running are stepping on the wounded who are crawling on the ground. I'm sure they're crying out. I can't watch this nightmare anymore." Despite the fascinating scene, she refused to look, taking her eyes off the crystal goblet and covering them with her hands. Miguel, desperate, continued to look at the vague forms flitting about. For some time he looked at them in vain. Later it seemed the scene was shifting. The furious shadows had calmed down somewhat. "Carr, look now. It looks like the battle's over." She came closer and gazed again at the tenuous and translucent mass. "It is over. The soil is lined with bloody corpses, almost all without heads. They've been beheaded. The blood is still flowing. One of the armies is moving away, but it's much, much smaller." Carr was about to yield again to the horror of the scene when the strong, loud whistle of the 5 o'clock train came to proclaim the new day. The deafening string of cars passed by. The light in the crystal goblet dimmed. "Drink Coca-Cola." Now Carr shared his secret with the same intensity and excitement. Strangely, they avoided talking about it during the day. There seemed to be in that phenomenon an inhibitive quality that made them hold back, wait to see what was to come. Which armies would those be? What people were they who fought so savagely? Clearly they had to be armies from the past, from the time that humanity, under the iron fist of blasphemous noblemen, forged its way through rivers of blood. But had humanity changed much since then? There is a certain protocol. Mankind had learned to submit, had understood it was best to obey definitive laws and avoid the sword's edge. The means are different now, but in essence the feelings, the spirit, are the same. A small minority orders and subjugates, and an immense majority obeys in exchange for a little more comfort, a little more bread, a little more circus. War now is an organized business. There is scientific destruction, death. Machines and devices save men in the battlefield, not out of respect for mankind and life. If this respect really existed, wars wouldn't occur. But because the machines kill the enemy faster, destroy more fully. Wars continue to dominate the history of our days, as they have dominated the history of mankind through all time. The spirit of it remains the same. If something changed, it was the means and the reasons. Laszlo showed up as usual at the end of the week with his wife and 2 kids. Miguel greatly admired his son-in-law and loved his daughter and grandchildren. He liked to see them enjoying the sun and the sea. He liked their jokes. On the terrace, while they had the drinks that always preceded the weekend lunch, Laszlo looked at his father-in-law and observed, "You seem worried. What is it?" Miguel gave a start. "It's nothing. Why?" "You seem worn out, tired, worried. That persecution story again?" "No, nothing like that. That's all calmed down now. It's something else." "It's something else. Then it is something." Miguel now felt compelled to speak. Laszlo was intelligent, cultured, sensible. His input would be useful should the phenomenon repeat itself for him to see. Miguel ended up telling him in detail about everything that had happened since he'd found the crystal goblet. Laszlo laughed, skeptical. "Well, you don't believe it?" "I'd like to see it." "Tonight." That night, Carr, Laszlo, and Miguel sat down around the goblet in the shed. The light soon reached the flaring point, filling the enclosure with an ethereal, bluish luminescence. Laszlo, his face hard, interested, stared at the goblet. Carr, her face almost resting on the crystal, seemed transported to another world. "There are ruins now," she said. "Great ruins." "Do you see anything, Laszlo?" Miguel asked. Laszlo made himself more comfortable, brought his face close to the goblet, and his blue eyes opened up. "They're ruins, without a doubt. Ruins of a gigantic city. Which city is it? Tokyo, New York, London, Moscow?" "They must be old cities, Laszlo. The battle we saw yesterday was fought between armies of the past. They can't be old cities, those ruins." Evidently Laszlo saw much better than Miguel, but Carr saw better than Laszlo. As a tacit concession, Carr continued describing what she was seeing. "They are great ruins. Ruins on the ground. People are moving among the ruins. Can you see? Strange people dressed in rags, half-naked women, but they seem deformed. Look, some men over there. Enormous heads. A woman with 4 breasts. No, 6. It's horrible. My God. There, that man. He has 4 arms. What a monstrous group. They're looking for anything among the ruins. Some are entering through the building's half-destroyed main door. The others outside are looking around like they're suspicious of something. The ones who entered, they're leaving. They're bringing an animal? It's a dog. Everyone's jumping on it. They're tearing up the dog. They're eating it." Carr was about to faint. She pulled back and covered her eyes. Laszlo couldn't make out the scene as clearly, but he saw enough to corroborate what Carr said. Miguel could still only see moving shadows. "Another group is coming from the other side," said Laszlo. "Look." Carr forced herself to look again, overcoming her revulsion. "It's another group of people like the first one. Deformed, badly dressed, skin and bones. They're running. They're falling over the others. They're fighting over bloody pieces of dog meat. I see sticks. They're starting to fight. Knives? They're all crazy. Worse than wild animals." Carr shouted. "Mother of God! No, no, no!" She struck the crystal goblet, and it hit the wall, and then clinked along for some distance on the cement floor, filling the storage shed with crystalline sounds. Laszlo rushed to grab it, and Miguel held his wife. "Calm down, hon. Control yourself. This is just a vision. Think a little. Like in a movie. Miguel, how horrible. They... But this isn't reality, Carr. They're visions. The goblet is like a magic lantern. It creates the scenes. Oh, Miguel, but this... But they were eating each other, right? But it's not real." Laszlo picked up the goblet and examined it. "It really doesn't break. What kind of crystal could this be?" The goblet was once again placed in its proper position and the shed filled with blue clarity. Miguel and Laszlo leaned over the goblet, but Carr didn't come close. For Miguel, the scenes continued with the same overlapping of loosely defined shapes. Laszlo saw well, though not very clearly. "It's awful," he murmured. "Where can this be? Are we receiving images from another planet? The scene's changing. You can look now, Carr. That other stuff has gone." Carr drew close again, still trembling. "All those people, those strange and deformed people, are running away down a wide avenue lined with ruins. Another apparently organized group is approaching from the other side. On the ground are pieces of meat. The ones that are coming now seem... Yes, They must be the same ones who were fighting. They're marching in formation. The others are fleeing, disappearing. Now the men that use swords and spears and shields pass by. I think they're going after them. The remains of a great building are coming into sight. I see a sign hanging. It's oval. If we could read, said Laszlo, moved. If I could read, maybe I could identify it. The time, if this is from Earth. Wait. I can read. Drink Coca-Cola? That's it. Drink Coca-Cola. That's what was written on the sign. Laszlo closed his hands around the crystal goblet. The shed turned dark. The bluish light that passed through his fingers was not strong enough to illuminate anything. "That's terrible," he said, and he walked with the goblet toward the shed door, which he opened to the night's darkness. "It's horrible. What we're seeing, Miguel, what we're seeing are scenes of the future. It's what awaits mankind. Ruins, a return to barbarity, creatures deformed by atomic radiation, hunger, misery. No, it can't be. This goblet is playing some trick. It can't be." "Why not?" Miguel said. "I really believe this is the most likely future for mankind. If mankind continues on the path it's following, men have never understood each other. There is always a threat of war and always a worse war. What threatens us now is an atomic war. How would it all end? All of us can foresee that. We don't need this crystal goblet. After a war of total destruction, what would remain of humanity, if not precisely those sick men we saw, those savages who were eating each other? As a matter of fact, humans never stopped being savage troglodytes. Mankind smeared itself with a coat of varnish when it started to discover and invent things. But everything collapses like a sandcastle with the smallest breath of war. The wars, the past and future ones, are always infinitely more harmful in their effects than their causes. If we think it over, they're not worth a thing. They're the expression of the momentary greed of mankind. They could easily be eliminated if people were able to overcome their pride, if they could reason and yield, but they don't. It's only after the disaster is consummated that they understand their mistake, even though they may not admit it. "Well, I believe in humanity," Laszlo said. "It may be that wars take us to extremes, but man is civilizing himself little by little. The future of mankind will be happy." "One can see that," Miguel commented summarily and bitterly. "Can we see a little bit more?" Carr suggested. "Who knows if a little further on—" Just then, the 5 o'clock train whistled, and soon after that it passed thundering by, little windows lit up, carrying half-asleep passengers. "It's over," said Carr, smiling. "The announcement of a new day. Fire! Fire!" That night they didn't watch the crystal goblet. They didn't see the continuation of the story of mankind on the face of the earth. Not that night, nor ever again. It was the last time the wonderful blue glow radiated from the strange goblet. They were all asleep at 9 in the morning when the kitchen maid entered the house crying out, "Fire! Fire! The shed!" Miguel jumped out of bed. Carr jumped too. Both ran outside and found Laszlo, who was already watching the flames. The shed at the back of the yard was ablaze. Even if there were anything they could do, it would have been useless. "The goblet might withstand the fire," said Miguel, his heart heavy. "A crystal of that quality, unbreakable and everything—" No one knows if it withstood it or not. Hours later, when all that remained of the shed were ashes and some smoking bars and handles, they made a detailed search. There was no sign of the magic goblet. "I believe," Laszlo said, "that the goblet was unbreakable, but highly flammable. It must have melted in the heat of the flames." "It may be. Who will ever be able to explain it all?" Introduction to A Cord Made of Nylon and Gold by Alvaro Menéndez Leal. Written in 1965. Translated by Andrea Bell. Central America is represented in this anthology by Alvaro Menéndez Leal, 1931 to 2000. The facetious pseudonym adopted by Alvaro Menéndez Leal. Leal means loyal, Desleal, its opposite. Desleal was born in Santa Ana, El Salvador, and enjoyed a career as a diplomat in Europe as a celebrated writer until his death in 2000. He published poetry, essays, short stories, and plays, and is perhaps most famous for his absurdist drama Black Light, 1966, which features two severed heads as the main characters. In his prose fiction, Desleal's specialties were science fiction, the Borgesian fantastic, and the humorous microsketch. In 1968, he submitted a collection of such pieces to a national literary competition where it took first prize. It was published in 1969 as A Cord Made of Nylon and Gold and Other Tales of the Marvelous. The title story was later reprinted in his collection of SF narratives, The Illustrious Android Family, 1972. Although it was difficult to select from among Desleal's many fine stories, we chose Nylon and Gold because of its artful structure and haunting imagery. It reflects the pessimism and the fear of nuclear annihilation that permeated the 1960s and 1970s, even in countries peripheral to the hegemonic struggles of those times. Desleal heightens the authenticity of the scenario he posits by making the main character an American, one Henry Olsen from Salt Lake City, Utah, and by peppering the story with references to current events of the day, to U.S. popular culture, and to the politics of the Cold War. A Cord Made of Nylon and Gold. Back then there was a president named Johnson, and my wife was sleeping with Sam Wilson. It was the 26th orbit. The whole thing lasted but a few seconds. "Henry! Henry!" my crewmate pleaded from inside the capsule. "Do you realize what you're about to do?" "It's useless, McDivitt," I told him. "I've already made up my mind." McDivitt continued pleading. I had cut the connection with the tracking station, so his words weren't reaching Earth. Otherwise, the voice of Captain Grissom, who was in charge of the project, would have rung out just as desperately. Or would Grissom, on Earth, be mute with shock? I don't know. I was floating in the void, 600 kilometers up, enveloped in my spacesuit. I had removed my thermal gloves to more comfortably operate the rocket gun with which I controlled the direction of my movements. The auxiliary tank on my back indicated enough oxygen for 110 minutes. If everything came out according to my calculations, that would be the maximum amount of time I would remain alive in space. "Henry! Henry! What will the president say?" 8 meters away from my body, apparently suspended immobile and magnificent in one point in space, the two-seater capsule completed its terrestrial orbit every 91 minutes. The hatch was open, which meant that McDivitt was also depending on his supply of portable oxygen. That's why I had to hurry, since I didn't want my decision to affect him. "Henry, what'll become of your kids?" The final appeal was useless. I removed the pliers I had carefully hidden upon boarding the ship in Cape Kennedy, and with their sharp jaws grasped the cord made of nylon and gold that tied me, like an umbilical cord, to the capsule. Before cutting, I took the precaution of saying goodbye to my partner. "Goodbye, McDivitt," I said, quite sarcastically. "I leave you to your marvelous world. Go on home like a good boy." Then I severed the cord with a single cut and discharged my rocket gun until it ran out, so as to get myself as far away from the ship as possible. I still managed to see how the nylon and gold cord retracted, and how, at last, the hatch door shut. With that, I felt totally free. Free in a black sky full of stars that don't twinkle. Free floating in the void at 28,500 kilometers per hour. Free at a distance of 600 kilometers from a planet I was fed up with. That was in August of 1965. 2 months earlier, McDivitt and White had completed a mission that we, on this launch, were basically copying. White had left the ship for 23 minutes. He was the second man after the Russian Leonov to do so. The space race, in which every astronaut expects to end up either scorched to death or with a wreath of flowers around his neck, like a Derby-winning horse, was attracting increasingly dramatic and vain types. If Leonov stayed in space for 20 minutes, then White stayed for 23. I was the third man chosen to do a spacewalk. I, Henry Olsen, of Salt Lake City. My mission was to do a complete orbit of Earth while suspended in the void, tied to the ship by a nylon and gold cord 8 meters long. I was supposed to stay out for 91 minutes doing stupid things, taking pictures, moving about, making fake repairs, clowning around, turning somersaults, all with that childish sense of humor we acquire, who knows why, at Cape Kennedy. But instead of breaking another idiotic record, instead of converting myself into the winning horse for the day, I preferred to free myself forever in exactly the 26th orbit. It was August of 1965. There was a president named Johnson. De Gaulle was threatening to checkmate NATO. My compatriots occupied the Dominican Republic. War was burning in Vietnam. The Russians had some kind of secret up their sleeve about reaching the moon. The Ku Klux Klan had murdered another black woman in Alabama. Von Braun was still doing science fiction. Rio de Janeiro had recently celebrated the 400th anniversary of its founding. San Salvador had just been partially destroyed by an earthquake. Women's fashion still pursued its mission of less fabric, more skin. 180 Japanese miners had died from a cave-in. Queen Elizabeth was writing postcards from Germany. China had just exploded its second atomic bomb. Ben Bella no longer ruled in Algeria. Frank Sinatra was doing things his way. Another record in car sales had been broken. My little boy John had broken a nose. I owed only $2,800 on the mortgage on my house. There was a president named Johnson, and my wife was cheating on me with Sam Wilson, her sister's old boyfriend. Sam Wilson, the redhead who could never handle the ball in high school rugby games. That was in 1965, in August. Today, I don't know anything more about Johnson, about Vietnam, about my kids, about Frank Sinatra. From the moment I cut the cord made of nylon and gold, I lost all contact with humanity. And although the Earth imposes its spherical presence on my multi-day scenery, sometimes it's at my feet, sometimes above me, sometimes at my side, I know nothing more about it. A large part of its surface is covered in clouds, but at first, recently free of the umbilical cord, I could occasionally make out the lights or shadows of the big cities. New York, I said to myself, and I would imagine a Fifth Avenue choked with a sea of people watching me, their necks stiff from the effort of keeping their heads in such an uncomfortable position. Moscow, I'd say, and I'd picture another multitude of proletarians, the women wearing babushkas. Buenos Aires, Paris, London, Melbourne. For a while I was content with my map of the world, hazy and less colorful than the one in school. I was amused by the spectacle without imagining the consequences of my desertion. Later came a few attempts to recover my body, and the Russians almost succeeded when they tried to fish me in with a kind of net. I always found ways to escape and remain free. Free and alive. Because something's happened that the scientists never guessed at. I was only supposed to live for 110 minutes, to live for precisely the length of time my oxygen supply lasted, but that's not what happened. I don't know why, but that's not what happened. I came to realize the phenomenon of my survival some 20 orbits after I'd cut the cord. Why, I asked myself, have I seen so many sunsets and sunrises? I began to count the number of times I saw dawn and dusk. When I got to around 120 sunrises, I got bored with counting. I calculated that the amount of sunrises was possible only at the speed I was traveling in something like a week's time. Then I got another surprise. The needle that indicated my oxygen tank's pressure was on full. I had, therefore, remained in space for days and days without needing to consume one bit of air. In other words, I didn't need air to survive. Then I discovered, I was always slow on the uptake, that when I crossed the shadowed cone of the Earth, I didn't feel colder, nor hotter when I was exposed to direct sunlight, and I didn't suffer hunger or thirst, pain or anguish. I felt happy, free and happy. I have no idea of the years that have passed since then. I haven't gone back to counting a single sunrise or sunset, but I believe I've seen millions. And although I still feel free, my happiness has changed to desperation, because I should have died a long time ago, not died out in space, so that my corpse would remain like a rock flung loose from some planet, but with them, with humans, back there on Earth, because they all died. I don't know why it happened, but little by little I realized how it happened. The sky was black and the stars shone without twinkling, with that majestic monotony they have when seen from space. On Earth, everything was clear, from Cape Kennedy to Italy, from Italy to Malaysia, over the Pacific and over California, and from there again to Cape Kennedy. Not a single cloud hid the shapes of the islands and continents. It was like a day designed to be a happy Sunday. Everything was as calm and quiet as always, maybe even calmer and quieter, because I could even seem to hear, I know it's foolish to say that, the shouts of the fans who must have been in the stands at Yankee Stadium. I wasn't thinking about anything. Why should I need to think about anything? And I contented myself with looking at the old familiar terrestrial scenery. Suddenly it exploded down below, to the north of Vietnam. It exploded in light and then as a mushroom, and I, swallowed up in the void, didn't hear any noise at all. Seconds later, 5, 10, 100 more brilliant flashes in China. When I crossed the Pacific and saw the territory of the United States, 100, 500 more bright lights lit up over San Francisco, Los Angeles, Detroit, New York, Washington, and another 100 to the south over Mexico and Panama and Rio and Buenos Aires, and more to the north above Montreal and Ottawa, and to the east above Cuba and Puerto Rico, and further east, on the other side of the Atlantic, the great flash over London, and the other 100 flashes in Paris, Madrid, Rome, and Bonn, and Belgrade, and further away, in Moscow, in Leningrad, in Ulaanbaatar, and in Tokyo, and Manila, and Hawaii. Always bright lights like a flash, explosions like millions of flashes. At the end of my orbit, slow mushroom clouds covered Asia. Another orbit, and the mushrooms were holding hands all across America, like a macabre ring around the rosy. And hundreds of serene mushrooms were growing over Europe and over Africa and over Oceania. I couldn't watch anymore. When I opened my eyes, much later, the Earth's sky was no longer clear. It was blood red. It was green. It was purple. A thick, multicolored cloud covered everything. That was a long time ago. Today, the cloud has dissipated, but I no longer see, in my 45-minute nights, the lights of a single city. No matter how hard I try, the dark side of the earth only seems dark, dark with a glow from beyond the grave. It's the same on the light side. The soft tones of the pampas are dark now. The forests and even the snow on the great mountains are gray, gray like lead or ashes. I'm still free. It's true that I'm still free, just like when I cut the nylon and gold cord back on that day when there was a president named Johnson. Vietnam was burning with war. Our Marines occupied the Dominican Republic. My son John had a broken nose. Frank Sinatra was singing his way. My wife was sleeping with Sam Wilson. And China exploded its second atomic bomb. Introduction to The Last Refuge by Eduardo Goligorsky. Written 1967, translated by Andrea Bell. Eduardo Goligorsky was born in 1931 in Buenos Aires, but since 1976 he has made his home in Spain, working as a journalist, editor, translator, critic, anthologist, and author. Before relocating to Spain, Goligorsky attained recognition as a prolific writer of Spillane School detective fiction. Writing as James Alistair, he published more than 20 detective novels, and in 1975 won a prize in a detective story contest judged by Borges, Marco Denevi, and Augusto Roa Bastos. Goligorsky was also a key figure in the Argentinian SF movement of the 1960s and 1970s, both for his fiction and for a landmark critical work. Science Fiction, Reality, and Psychoanalysis, 1969, co-authored by psychologist and SF author Marie Langer. He also collaborated with Alberto Vanasco on two short story collections, Future Memories, 1966, and Farewell to Tomorrow, 1967, and he wrote the prologue to Argentinians on the Moon, 1969. We selected The Last Refuge for this volume not just for its narrative interest, but because it serves as an excellent example of Latin American political SF. In an interview published alongside this story, Goligorsky said, quote, "My worst nightmares, which are expressed in my fiction and essays, were made real in Argentina between 1966 and 1983, a country degraded by oppression, violence, necrophilia, irrationality, demagoguery, and xenophobia, a country which the ultra-right, the idiotic left, and the chauvinist populists tried to isolate from the most fertile currents of civilized thought." End quote. This is the Argentina that forms the political backdrop of the present story. Anyone familiar with the terror and persecution characterizing so many authoritarian regimes the world over will appreciate the plight of Goligorsky's tragic hero as he desperately seeks the last refuge. The Last Refuge. The man could feel his eyes filling with tears. Before him stood a spaceship, a gigantic metallic disc that seemed to be made of two immense plates joined at the edges. The observation panels and the hatchway were on the upper inverted plate, and a ring of vertical tubes encircled the entire disc at the edge where the two plates met. These were the propulsion devices. He recognized the image he'd seen so often in his photographs, but never before had he been just an arm's length away from a spaceship, as he was now. And that was why he felt like crying. "Bye, Madonna. See you tomorrow, Guy. Bye. Bye." Guillermo Madonna, surprised to see his wife standing on the street corner, said his goodbyes distractedly. Marta hadn't combed her hair, and some of her gray locks fell across her forehead. She was wearing the old dress she used when going to market. Madonna realized that something bad must have happened. She didn't approach him, though, but remained standing on the corner, motionless. "Marta, what's wrong? Why'd you come here like that?" She took him by the arm and headed off down the street. This wasn't the way to their house. What's more, she was trying to keep him away from his co-workers, who were still hanging about in small groups. "Goodbye, Mr. and Mrs. Madonna." "Hey, what's wrong?" he repeated. "What?" Marta looked around to make sure no one could hear her, and then, without slowing down, said, "Carlitos found the album. I forgot to lock the dresser drawer, and he found the album." A knot formed in Madonna's throat. He felt like he might throw up then and there, but somehow he got hold of himself. Suddenly it was he who was dragging Marta along as she clung to his arm. "Well, how do you know?" "He told me himself. I hadn't noticed it was missing from the drawer." "And what did he do?" "Listen to me. He took it to school. The pictures really impressed him, and he wanted to share his treasure with his classmates. He told me the teacher saw it, too. The teacher gave it to the principal. They asked Carlitos whose it was, and he said it was his father's. I don't know how it is they let him come home. I'm sure they've already notified the Department of Internal Security. The police must be looking for you. You've got to escape. You've got to—" "But where can I go?" whispered Madonna. "You have to escape," she insisted, unable to think of anything else. "Anywhere, right now. They'll come looking for you at work." It was getting dark. Madonna could see that his wife's eyes were shining with tears. He hugged her fiercely. A soft purring sound emanated from the spaceship. At times the noise would grow louder, and the propulsion tubes would emit little blue flames. When that happened, the temperature in the vicinity of the ship rose, but the man didn't seem to notice it. His fingers caressed the metallic surface of the fuselage and touched the grooves left by rains of cosmic dust. The man had the impression that, through the workings of some strange magic, this contact allowed him to commune with the far-off galaxies that had always inhabited his dreams and that were forbidden to him. Madonna kept going the whole night long. At times he ran, at times he trudged along slowly, but he never stopped. He chose the darkest, emptiest streets. He never came across the police. At last he felt the need to stop and leaned against a rickety wooden fence. He tried to catch his breath. It was starting to get light, and the kerosene streetlights were still lit up on their aluminum posts. A noise made him feel anew the sharp stab of fear, the splash of a horse's hooves in the mud of a cross street, and the squeaking of cart wheels. He looked around for some place to hide, but found nothing. The wooden fences of the small farms stretched out in an unbroken line, offering not even a chink into which he could squeeze himself. Madonna knew that if he tried to climb over one of the fences, the poorly nailed boards would come clattering down around him. He chose to press up close against the fence, far away from the street lights, fading into the shadows. At last the cart appeared at the intersection. It was coming down Maipo Street and kept going straight, nothing to do with the police. Madonna resumed walking along Laval Street toward the Bajo, quickening his step each time he passed under one of the street lights. He had another scare when a dog barked at him from behind a fence, but the animal had already calmed down by the time Maidana crossed San Martin. The only sounds were his own footsteps in ground drenched from the recent rains, the croaking of frogs in the coastal marshlands, and the song of the crickets. A rough-hewn sign leaning up against a lamp-post bore a message written in heavy black letters. Our dignity rejects the temptations of materialism, which has enslaved the world. The upper right-hand edge of the poster had come unglued, and the fugitive grabbed the hanging corner as he passed by and yanked at it. As expected, underneath it was another slogan. We are the last refuge of Western civilization. We are not afraid to be alone. Maidana made a face and quickly left the circle of yellowish light cast by the kerosene lamp which swung back and forth overhead. The man stood facing the ship, and his outstretched arms seemed to want to embrace the lower hemisphere of the spacecraft. He rubbed his cheek against the rough metal surface, leaving behind a damp track of tears. It was like crying over the stars. From within him burst a hoarse cry. "Please, let me in. I'm your friend." Instinct drove Maidana toward the river. It wasn't as if from there it would be any easier to escape. All exit routes, whether by water, land, or air, had been closed. It had been centuries since any ship had touched the coast. No one left the country, and shipping was strictly prohibited. One of the most enduring principles of the regime was, "Let us close our borders to materialist illusion." In order to comply with this slogan, first all tourist traffic was halted, then study abroad trips were canceled, and finally all commerce and correspondence with the outside world were forbidden. Nostalgia for a civilization with which all ties had been severed became a sort of clandestine birthright for a handful of reprobates and misfits. But although he could not dream of finding refuge out beyond the quagmires of Leandro Alem, Maidana headed into that sector and made his way to the small mountain near the coast. He plunged in among the brush, trying not to trip over any of the fallen trunks and avoiding the gullies and bogs. The first light of day illuminated his path. The smell that came from the damp, rotten wood and the stagnant ponds was getting steadily stronger. His shoes were filled with water, and his wet pant legs clung to his skin. Mosquitoes formed an impenetrable cloud around his head, and he felt the quick sting of leeches on his calves. The man beat on the armored surface with his fists, ignoring the skin being scraped off his knuckles. Every blow left behind a stain of blood, but he felt no pain. He only wanted them to open the hatchway to grant him asylum within the depths of the shining capsule. He shouted and pounded, shouted and pounded. The sound that came from the interior of the ship became increasingly loud and regular. Once more, little blue flames spat from the propulsion tubes. The atmosphere was getting hotter. "Open up! Open up!" While he made his way through the undergrowth, Maidana told himself it was paradoxical that his own son had revealed the album's existence to the authorities. The mission in store for him was indeed different. Carlitos would have become the guardian of the album as soon as he'd reached adolescence. That was how possession of that heirloom had always been passed on. That was how Guillermo Maidana had obtained it, given to him by his father, who, on that sober occasion, had told him the album's history. One of his ancestors had served in the air fleet that had made the last trips to the outside. It was he who had gathered together the collection of photographs that had opened a fragile window onto universal civilization. The family held on to the album when, a short time later, the regime ordered the confiscation of everything that glorified the false progress of materialism, that was unworthy of the solemn tradition of our native individualism. Thus began their defiance, and thus was the album transformed into the secret object of their cult. On Sundays, when Carlitos went to play in the park with his friends, he and Marta had often taken advantage of being alone to remove the album from its hiding place and look through it. This ritual, which their ancestors must have repeated countless times, transported them to a world of dreams and imagination. The photograph of the huge seawater desalination plants installed in the Sahara was next to the one of the transparent survival domes scattered across the fantastic purple landscape of Mars. Beside a picture of the Karachi skyscrapers was one that captured the intricate arabesques of the gray, elastic vegetation of Venus. One photo's radiant colors showed the 20 stacked artificial terraces where wheat was grown in Xinjiang, and another displayed the proud outline of the Einstein 3, the first spaceship to have a crew made up of representatives from every nation in the World Council. The last picture in the album showed a misty panorama with colossal towers of green stone rising up in the background. It was agreed. The first extraterrestrial city the World Council explorers had discovered. Maidana experienced a feeling of profound disgust when he thought that the album was now in the hands of the regime's security agents. There were few collections left in the country that contained so many of the forbidden images. The man clawed at the ship's fuselage. The violent scratching against the metallic surface had destroyed his fingernails. His hands were two bloody wounds. Rendered numb, he did not feel the temperature rising as more blue flames shot out from the propulsion tubes above his head. He didn't hear the growing rumble of the ship's engines. One idea only was lodged in his brain. He had to break through the armored shell that separated him from the inside of the spacecraft. "Open up! Open up!" The roar of the engines drowned out his voice. Maidana abruptly stopped walking, and his hand clenched a tree branch. His feet sank a little further into the mud of the swamp, but he paid no attention to that. A different sort of picture had caught his attention. He was at a place where the mountain's vegetation was starting to thin out again. From there, a strip of sand, mud, and limestone stretched out, and roughly 2 blocks ahead was the river. He heard the splashing of water and waves, but that wasn't what had him rooted to the spot. The sun's rays were sparkling with dazzling light on a giant metallic disk. It was a ship, a spaceship. Above the dome that shaped the upper part into a curve was the emblem of the World Council, and there it was on the beach, immobile, separated from Buenos Aires by nothing but the swamps and scrublands of the Bajo. Maidana realized that something extraordinary must have happened. His eyes had often followed the World Council ships on their glittering path across the sky, but never in the last 20 years had one landed in the Forbidden Zone. Once, due to a breakdown in the guidance system, a ship had come down near the city of Tandil. Its crew had gone out in search of help and had been gunned down by a watch patrol. The next day, a proclamation announced that the security forces had discovered and wiped out a gang of foreign infiltrators. The story became the main theme of the regime's propaganda for a year, and after that the affair was never spoken of again. The abandoned spaceship, which turned out to be indestructible, was surrounded by a fence so as not to awaken any unhealthy curiosity. The ship must also have suffered some kind of breakdown, but its crew already knew the risks associated with landing there. The hatchways were hermetically sealed, and the beach around the vessel was empty. No doubt the mechanics were inside the ship working quickly to repair the problem and leave before morning passed and a watch patrol showed up. Maidana walked toward the ship, slowly and cautiously at first, then more quickly. He crossed the last stretch of beach at a run. He could feel his eyes filling with tears. He'd fallen to his knees beneath the curve of the fuselage. He covered his face with his hands, and the blood from his torn fingers mixed with the tears that ran down his cheeks. The engines roared above his head. The column of blue fire that burst from the propulsion tubes enveloped the figure kneeling on the beach, and then seemed to become solid, supporting the ship as it rose. The displaced air formed a whirlwind that shook the branches of the nearest trees and churned up a cloud of blackened dust and ashes. Then, slowly, the dust and ashes fell softly back down to the deserted beach. Introduction to Future by Luis Brito Garcia. Written 1970, translated by Andrea Bell. Luis Brito Garcia, born 1940, is a name widely recognized by scholars of contemporary Latin American literature and political thought, though not one immediately associated with SF. He is, however, one of the many accomplished mainstream Latin American authors who can count fantastical and science-fictional texts among their body of work. Brito Garcia was born in Caracas and is a senior professor in the economics department at the Universidad Central de Venezuela, where his field of inquiry is the history of political thought. He is an outspoken Marxist and critic, and his numerous penetrating essays are essential reading for any student of Venezuelan politics and postmodernity. These essays include I Laugh at the World, 1984, Power Mask, 1988, and Countercultural Empire, From Rock to Postmodernity, 1991. His creative work has brought Brito Garcia many international accolades. In 1970, for example, he won the prestigious Casa de las Americas Prize for his collection of short fictions Rajatabla, from which we take our story. And in 1979, he became a second-time winner with his novel Abra Palabra. Brito Garcia has also won several awards as a playwright and as a humor writer. In the tradition of dystopian literature, the micro-story we include here is fittingly entitled Future. This story manages to distill the essence of our humanity and challenges us with the paradox intrinsic to our desire for utopian perfection. Future. Thesis. And the perfect society was attained, and the madness of the human species diminished, and mankind was ready to devote its energies to the pursuit of a goal. Antithesis. Then they discovered there was no goal to which they could devote themselves. Synthesis. Therefore, they deified as a goal the absence of all goals, that is, stagnation. Thesis. In the first place, humanity had to free itself from work, and thus began the maddest rush of teamwork ever to be directed at the goal of not working. Antithesis. Finally, all human work was done by machines, and the machines were made by other machines, which in turn were run by other machines, and thus humanity freed itself from work. Synthesis. Thus it was that all of the body's mechanical faculties, the musculature, the limbs, and the capacity to move itself or to move objects, ceased to be useful. They atrophied and, in the end, disappeared. Thesis. In the second place, humanity had to free itself from the slavery of food. Antithesis. All the powers of chemistry were employed in the synthesis of proteins and carbohydrates from inanimate matter and heat, and finally, through the use of atomic power, matter and energy were transmuted in laboratories until they formed the most purely distilled quintessential nourishment, able to pass directly into the broth of blood without previous digestion. Synthesis, whereupon the mouth and the stomach and the intestines and the liver and the viscera in general ceased to be burdened with the arduous task of wringing energy from food, and they atrophied and, in the end, disappeared. Thesis. In the third place, humanity had to free itself from death. Antithesis. And in the laboratories, they rounded up the toxins that produced the degeneration known in former times as old age, and they corrected the genes that had caused the suicide of the individual, known as death. And from organic matter came the synthesis of protoplasm, and from the synthesis of protoplasm came the synthesis of immortality. Synthesis, whereupon procreation became unnecessary and the reproductive organs ceased to be useful. They atrophied and, in the end, disappeared. Thesis. And it was during this dawn of the spirit that the intellect, now Lord and Master of the universe, was empowered to embark upon the boldest of adventures within the purest realms of abstraction. Antithesis. Freed from work, freed from hunger, freed from sex, freed from death, the human brain prepared to launch into the face of all creation its most potent fruit, one born not of any intestinal imperative nor appetite of the flesh. A monumental event was about to take place. Synthesis. In effect, the human brain also ceased to be necessary. It, too, atrophied, and in the end it, too, disappeared. Introduction to When Pilate Said No, by Hugo Correa, written 1971, translated by Andrea Bell. Hugo Correa, born 1926, is the man widely credited with launching modern science fiction in Latin America. Indeed, the spark of life he gave the genre regionally was recognized by the Spanish SF magazine Nueva Dimensión, which honored his contributions to the field by dedicating an entire issue to him, number 33, 1972. Correa was born in the southern Chilean province of Talca. His long writing career, he is still active in the Chilean SF community, began, as is often the case in Latin America, in journalism, and from there branched out to include criticism, drama, and prose fiction. Although he has written realist works, his métier is SF, in which he first became interested after reading Bradbury, Simek, and Sturgeon. His early efforts in the genre met with considerable success. The novel The Superior Ones, 1959, and his novella Someone Dwells Within the Wind, 1959, were immediate classics. Someone Dwells Within the Wind was awarded the Alerce Prize by the University of Chile and is representative of his best work. He went on to win other prizes for his short fiction, and in 1974 was awarded a grant through the University of Iowa's International Writing Program. Correa has the distinction of being one of the first Latin American SF writers to have had his work published in the United States. He had sent one of his stories, The Last Element, to Ray Bradbury, who liked it, suggested Correa submit it to the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, and then dropped a note to the magazine's editors on Correa's behalf. The story was published in the April 1962 issue. Another story, Alter Ego, was published in MF and SF's 1967 issue and was later reprinted in the textbook Introductory Psychology through SF, 1974, and in the Penguin World Omnibus of SF, 1986. As being published in the United States was the highest mark of success for Latin American SF writers at the time, Correa's accomplishments were greatly inspiring to contemporaries such as Elena Aldunate, author of the classic story Juana and Cybernetics, 1963. Correa continues to be recognized and admired, and he is a source of inspiration and support to a new generation of Chilean SF writers. The first contact story we have included here, When Pilate Said No, is taken from his eponymous 1971 anthology. A cautionary tale written in the midst of the Cold War, it can be read as an indictment of the space race and of the hubris and bigotry that lead to genocide. The story also continues the debate, beloved by SF writers, over the comparative powers of religion and science. When Pilate Said No. The Tierra, tall as a 40-story skyscraper, rose up imposingly between the blue desert dunes. To the north, a mountain range whose saw-toothed peaks split the sky stretched the length of the horizon until its last hand-shaped foothills reached out into the sands like slumbering claws. To the west and south lay only wasteland, which gave off iridescent sparks in the sunlight. Behind the mountain range and along its northern slopes lived the Dumis in caves whitewashed with sticky mud, their entrances hidden by dense forests. From the bridge beneath the ship's tapered prow, Captain Ortuzar, a short, burly man with bushy eyebrows and a choleric expression engraved on his face, without which his squashed features would have seemed altogether flat, slouched in his chair and watched the television screen. It showed various scenes of the Dumi settlements that the Auto Explorer, a tiny teleguided helicopter, was capturing and transmitting to the rocket. What a bizarre mix of reptile and insect. We could never live with them. It's a social impossibility, agreed Murchison, the spaceflight engineer. And on Earth they still dare speak of the incommunicability of the spirits. We should congratulate ourselves on our human condition. Well, I suppose the Dumis would say the same thing, except in reverse. True, optimism is the essential quality of all life. Still, I bet those bugs are ashamed of their appearance and habits. Rossi's investigations confirm that. Now that remains to be seen, Captain. Their unexpected submissiveness could very well be a strategy. It strikes me as exaggerated. For the Dumis' reactions to the arrival of man were manifold and contradictory. They began by murdering Veliz at close range. One of their poisoned spears pierced the radio operator, and his body, which swelled horrifically until exploding, was devoured in a tumult of wild rejoicing. Not satisfied with that, the Dumis then hurled themselves at the rocket in an ill-conceived attack. The Tierra, an unassailable fortress whose defense systems automatically fired their weapons, repelled the attack, accompanied by the sizzle of leathery flesh and bursts of red smoke. All the Dumis together would have been incapable of seizing the spaceship, even had they possessed some basic understanding of military organization. And then the unexpected happened. The Dumis laid down their arms and, with the most abject servility, offered the men the governance of their territories. Thus did they acknowledge human superiority. The explorers had to stay on the New World for 30 days before returning to Earth. The chance to seal their victory was what convinced Captain Ortuzar, as head of the expedition, to accept the Dumis' offer, provided they maintained their distance from the Tierra, as their repulsive appearance and natural stench made them unwelcome neighbors. This condition was humbly accepted. From then on, the men could circulate freely among those creatures and get help with their researches and investigations. A strategy? No, Murchison. If that's your name for terror, then I'll agree with you. They're afraid of us, Murchison. That's all. They can't forget that night when we roasted 100 of them in the blink of an eye. Is any strategy a match for immensely superior technology? Multiplied by 1,000 the difference between the Spanish conquistadors and the American Indians, you wouldn't even come close to the human-Dumi relationship. The television focused on Rossi, the archaeologist, who stood in front of a building that resembled a truncated tower. Captain, this is a paradise of amorality. Cannibalism, political anarchy, legalized theft, and other such things. And you know what? They're very happy this way. Only one aspect of human civilization has gotten their attention. You're going to laugh. They're impressed by the story of Christ. They've never had a savior. Do you think they've needed one? That's one way their evolution hasn't been held back. But this is a very ancient people, Captain, and you can see their level of civilization is nil. Okay, but it might just be there's a lot of congenital stupidity, right? Maybe, although months before our arrival, a prophet appeared. A prophet? Yeah, he lives in the desert, says he's the son of a superior being. Some Dumis gather around every day to listen to him. What do you think of that? Night fell, escorted by the shadows of nearby mountains which crept across the dunes until touching the rocket. Millions of lights pierced the vastness. The Tierra, isolated citadel from another world, glinted metallically in the turquoise eve. One enormous star, which stood out clearly from its neighbors, poured forth its pale light from above. It's a nova, just as we thought. It appeared 30 years ago on exactly the same night the prophet was born, Rossi reported from the bridge. A warm breeze, saturated with mineral emissions, blew across the desert. That'd be the new Star of Bethlehem, Captain. That, too, is supposed to have been a nova. At least we're not the three wise men, eh, Rossi? He added with indifference. Do these monstrosities connect the appearance of the star with the prophet's arrival? The archaeologist continued to gaze at the shadowy, far-off mountains, the home of the Dumis. They don't elaborate much on the subject. If they hadn't heard the story of Christ, I bet they would have remained silent. Even so, they don't say much. Humans have nothing in common with those smelly vermin, Rossi. They're byproducts of nature. Just as I've refused to show them the ship, I refuse to consider them to be like me. It is hard to believe, Captain, agreed Nasakov, the chief astrogator. And that prophecy? What effect has it had on these beasts? Only anticipation, which was interrupted by our arrival. The majority of the Dumis found the story ridiculous, but since the electronic translator caught only half the sounds of their infernal language, what Rossi had been able to puzzle out, plus guesswork to fill in the blanks, made for a vague whole. The prophet's teachings were similar to the earthly messiahs: love for one's neighbor, humility, rejection of material goods in favor of eternal life, etc. He also worked some wonders that could be considered miracles. He prophesied the arrival of the Tierra and opposed the attack on the rocket. That last one earned him the enmity of the majority. No one wanted anything to do with him now. They even talked about sacrificing him, for fear he would divide the Dumi people. He has a few adherents, along with a group of disciples, but they're so apathetic, I'm sure they'll abandon him at the first sign of trouble. No one can make those bugs understand, Rossi. Crackpots, people who believe they can fix the world, are everywhere, even on a planet inhabited by worms. But the Dumis will never be able to understand even the most elementary principles of coexistence. They eat each other. Yes, agreed Rossi. They resolve their misunderstandings through one-to-one combat, and the victor after selecting the most appetizing morsels, leaves the rest to the collective and takes himself off for a solo feast. They're ignorant of law and polities. The captain punctuated his words with energetic movements of his short arms. They only united to attack us, but without coming up with any sort of plan first, because even that's beyond them. But on more than one occasion, they've come to ask you for a judgment, Captain. That's something. They take their role as subjects seriously, because they don't want to take on any sort of responsibility. We've replaced their rudimentary government in a way that benefits them. They still enjoy their freedom, committing all the depravities they care to, knowing we wouldn't intervene in their affairs even if they decided to devour each other in one big orgy. Which would be a splendid solution, don't you think? Because there's one thing I must tell you. When this planet is colonized, not a single Doomy is going to be left alive. We're proceeding in a humanitarian manner because the time's not yet come to put things in their place. But when men come in search of the crucial space we're running out of on our world, the killing will begin. It's survival, boys, nothing more. Men aren't going to share this magnificent planet with the Doomies when it can be colonized without resorting to expensive artificial methods. The captain's words rebounded in a final echo. Just then, one of the moons, huge as mill wheels, their flat expanses festooned in red and gold, barren like Earth's satellite, rose above the sandy plains. Its iridescent light wrapped the Tierra in an icy blanket. "What's happening?" The face of one of the men on guard duty appeared on the television screen. "The Sentinels spotted a group of Doomies headed this way. Captain, what should we do?" The captain appeared surprised. "I'll speak to them." In a few seconds, the auto-explorer, powered by its silent rotor, halted above the Doomies. A beam of light shone down on the monsters. They retreated, waving their multiple arms. "What do you want? Don't come even a meter closer." The translator broadcast Ortuzar's words via the automatic loudspeaker. One of the Doomies, indistinguishable from the rest, whistled its response, which was picked up by the helicopter's microphones. "We have captured an individual who passes himself off as a prophet. As he has managed to beguile a part of the population, we wish you to authorize us to sacrifice him because of the danger that he will divide the Doomy people and start a war." "Since when are they so fussy?" the captain asked Rossi. "Don't they kill each other for lunch on a daily basis without consulting us?" "Only for personal reasons, or when they're very hungry, Captain. There's never been a war among the Doomies." "Aha! So they have their principles." He thought for a few moments. The electronic eye focused on the motionless crowd awaiting the verdict. "And if he really were the Redeemer?" exclaimed the archaeologist. "So what?" "Well, Captain, it would mean nothing more nor less than that you'd be playing the role of Pontius Pilate." Ortuzar chewed his nails and looked at his men, who remained silent. "And what of it, after all? They must know what they're doing." "It's not that simple, Captain," replied Rossi. "Even though he may belong to a repulsive species, that prophet is trying to preach good things. His gospel might change these people. If I were you, I wouldn't pass judgment lightly." "Yeah, you're right. This is putting me in a tough spot." "Well, tell them to wait a few minutes." Captain Ortuzar, for the first time in his 40 years of life, hesitated. But he decided to follow Rossi's advice. The Doomies answered that they would wait there for his decision. Ortuzar began to pace about the bridge. He looked at the shining instrument panel, The complicated dials, the multicolored levers and buttons, the radar and television screens, and all the marvelous instruments capable of steering the spaceship across the cosmos without human intervention. They're doomed. Whatever my decision is, it won't change their future. I'll be doing them a favor if I refuse to allow the sacrifice of this prophet. If a spaceship had landed on Earth on the eve of Golgotha and its captain had prevented the crucifixion, humanity wouldn't have had to wait so long for the advent of technology. He stopped in front of the library and, pressing a button, whispered the name Pontius Pilate into the microphone. An impersonal voice summarized the Tetrarch's life story. What a fool! In order to evade responsibilities, he lost the opportunity to become mankind's greatest benefactor. One washing of hands that submerged the world in 15 centuries of darkness. That triggered an era of senseless religious wars in order to impose a hunch of abstractions without achieving a single positive result. He looked at the television. On the screen, the somber group. There's no escape for you. In 2 centuries more, you'll all be destroyed. He peered out the window. The light, high on the horizon, insinuated an invisible curtain over the emerging stars, rendering them faint, almost imperceptible. Only the great star, the nova, sustained its radiant gleam. Very soon now, the second satellite would make its appearance. On the horizon, a reddish glow, like a gigantic transparent dome, heralded its ascent. If God exists, no doubt he forgot the Doomies, and if the one awaiting my judgment is his son, well, he's clearly arrived too late. There's nothing he can do to save his people. Still, the captain struck his forehead. I almost forgot. I must not allow that prophet to die. The archaeologist, Murchison, and the 2 astrogators approached the captain. Gentlemen, I will oppose the sacrifice of that prophet. A brief silence ensued, broken by Rossi. Are you sure about what you're doing, Captain? Don't get suspicious, Rossi. The captain laughed. Do you think I'm trying to make some subtle theological point? No. Above all, I'm practical. That prophet's doctrine would turn the Doomies into meek, submissive beings. And there are still reactionary souls on Earth who, for that very reason, would be against exterminating them. It'd be fatal. Eventually the Doomies, as native sons of this world, could assimilate our knowledge and subjugate humans, who, as transplants, would be at a disadvantage. Do you understand? Survival, gentlemen. We have to look further ahead and not settle for being mere explorers. My decision will be pivotal for the human race, because we won't leave it any annoying problems. Again, it was the archaeologist who spoke up, in view of the others' silence. Don't you think your zeal is a bit extreme, Captain? Murchison spoke up. I think the captain's right. It seems like an excellent idea to me. Me too, said Nasokov. The others all agreed in turn. And what do you plan to do with the prophet and his disciples? Asked Rossi. Simply lock them up in the hold and take them to Earth. They'll serve as field samples. It's the only way to guarantee their survival. It's just that on Earth, they'll form an excellent impression of the Doomies on the basis of those samples, Captain, Rossi hinted. Ortuzar flew into a rage. I'm in charge here, Rossi. If need be, I'll kill those buggers once we're in space, just to avoid what you're saying. Or don't you think I'd foreseen that? The captain turned to the television and spoke in a dry voice. My verdict is this. You must turn the prophet over to me immediately." The response seemed one of irritation, though fearful. "May we know the reasons for this decision?" "No. It is my verdict, and you must respect it." "Sir, in this special case, we believe you should explain to the Dumi people the reasons which moved you to return that judgment." "What's this?" The captain turned to his men, between amused and peeved. "Offer explanations to those freaks? They must be crazy." And turning back to the monsters, he added, "In this special case, dear Doomies, what I order shall be done. And I swear that if you do not obey, I'll exterminate you all. Agreed?" The Doomies whispered among themselves. The captain didn't take his eyes off the prophet, who could be told from the others by an odd frill that rose from his large head. "As you command, sir." The voice over the loudspeaker was colorless. "We believe this to be an arbitrary act because—" "Enough!" roared the captain. "Have the prophet and his disciples come forward, and the rest of you move back. Don't try anything treacherous." Unwillingly, the group parted to make way for the condemned. "Hurry up, before I change my mind." The 15 Doomies moved away from their captors and advanced in a disorderly throng toward the rocket. "Captain," muttered Rossi, "delay your order. You're making a mistake." Rossi stumbled against something that protruded from the instrument panel and lost his balance. When he tried to regain it, he gave the impression of attacking Ortuzar. Nasokov, who was closest, reacted in a flash. A sharp blow sounded, and Rossi, punched on the chin, fell to the floor. He made a weak effort to stand up and then collapsed again, heavily. "Leave him there," the captain ordered, and he ordered the men guarding the airlock, "Get ready to receive the Son of God. As soon as he's entered, bring him to me." Turning to the others, he added, "I'll try to suppress my disgust, considering who's visiting us." The bulk of the crew slept. The monstrous creature came swaying into the airlock. It called to mind both spider and lizard. Large polyhedral head from which sprouted, on 4 sides, a cluster of multifaceted eyes and weird, vibrating antennae. Numerous articulated tentacles jutted out from its misshapen body, ending in strange, pointy claws covered with bristles. Greenish drops gleamed between the quills like dew among the grass. Thin sheets of some extremely hard substance protected its sides, chest, and back like an insect's wing covers. It walked semi-erect, supported by a bunch of short, skinny legs. The monster's dark coloring heightened its ugliness. The 14 disciples entered the rocket in succession, and the Dantean group in the center of the airlock gave the impression of something that might have been called humility, had it been possible to draw parallels between their attitudes and those of humans. An acrid and revolting odor spread through the atmosphere, in spite of the air conditioning. "Let the prophet, the one with the frills on his head, come up. The rest should wait there until further orders." Rossi was dragged out of the navigation room. He was still unconscious. The others kept their eyes fixed on the lift. The door opened, and the Doomy made his entrance. He advanced with a certain majesty, moving in that curious slanting manner of his kind. The men had to repress a shudder of fear. The captain warned him to stop at a prudent distance. "Well, I imagine you're grateful to us for having saved you from certain death." When he said this, the captain winked quickly at Murchison, saying under his breath, "Will this vermin speak in parables?" "To be sure," replied the prophet. That is, he emitted a series of whistles and squawks mixed with a prolonged wail, which echoed in the corners of the room. The translator did its job in a fraction of a second, and a human voice, lifeless and metallic, retransmitted the answer. "We expect nothing less from human kindness." "Ah!" the captain exclaimed. Now, electronic voices capable of reproducing Doomy phonetics with great accuracy came from the loudspeaker. The grotesque creature comically twisted its head in order to hear better. "That means that my intercession didn't upset your plans." "1,000 years ago," replied the Doomy, "a prophecy was made about our people, that the Doomies would be saved on the day beings arrived from afar. The first part of this prophecy has been fulfilled. Men have come to our world." "Did you know about this, Rossi?" asked the captain, looking around for the archaeologist. Only then did he remember he was asleep in his cabin. He made a gesture of annoyance and went on interrogating the prophet. "What else did the prophecy say?" "That those beings belonging to a superior and redeemed race would land on our planet at the precise time when I would be preaching my gospel. This part has also come to pass." The captain became nervous. Something wasn't going right. What was he doing, chatting with this rancid bug? He'd already achieved his aim. He had him in his power. "Lastly," continued the Doomy, "that those beings would try to prevent our salvation by opposing my sacrifice." "Olivera Fresnay!" shouted the captain, assailed by a sudden suspicion. He was unable to complete the order. The prophet threw himself at him. Ortuzar drew his gun and fired. The monster exploded in a cloud of red smoke. The men coughed, choking on the sickening stench. They fell to the ground where they remained motionless, their bodies blurred by the scarlet mist. The captain came to. He was tied to a chair. Before his eyes, still fuzzy from the narcotic, one of the Doomies took shape. He choked back a cry. Several monsters shuffled about in the huge room, curiously examining the instrument panel. They didn't touch it. They confined themselves to looking at it, exchanging muffled comments the electronic translator couldn't pick up. The smell of the vaporized Doomy still hung in the atmosphere, although the air conditioner was working. A deformed claw, hairy and soaked with droplets, waved before his eyes. Ortuzar threw his head back to distance himself from the beast. Looking around in search of help, he could see his shipmates, also tied up, beginning to regain consciousness. But he didn't have time to keep looking around. Something grazed his body. A red lance, long as a fencing foil and protruding from one of the Doomy's extremities, was aimed at his chest. He felt the sharpness of the point pressing softly against him. The monster's sibilant words echoed in his ears, along with the metallic voice of the translator. "Disconnect the alarms and open the doors." The order permitted neither reply nor hesitation. Ortuzar turned to the control panel and moved a series of levers. Pressed to the back of his chair, he could feel the point of the lance. The ties allowed him to move his hands with some amount of freedom. The idea of starting up the reactors vaguely crossed his mind. The rocket's acceleration would render his captors powerless, although the men too would suffer the effects of inertia. But he realized that the lance would transfix him before the Tierra, propelled by the atomic blast, could begin to lift off. "Go back to your place," ordered the Doomy. Another Doomy went to the window to inform those waiting outside that the hatches were open. "You men have locked down upon the Doomies," said the one who was acting as chief, the same one who had threatened the captain and was surely one of the apostles. While it is true that we are ignorant of the scientific and technical secrets of humans, we are master psychologists. What better than to make you believe that the Son of God had come here to preach his gospel among us? Men would not waste the chance to laugh at God. In his twisted mind would be born the notion of refusing the sacrifice of the Savior, a demonstration that the Maker had been bested, because he whom you killed, Captain, was neither prophet nor Son of God, but just an ordinary doomy. He and we, his disciples, ingested certain plants that were we to be vaporized by your vile weapons, would make our bodies emit a gas that would fully incapacitate you, but not harm us. It succeeded far beyond our expectations. Your ingenious ventilation systems quickly carried the gas throughout the entire rocket before decontaminating it, and the whole crew was brought to its knees in a matter of seconds. As you can see, he who died has saved us. Saved? What do you mean? Stammered the captain. He has saved us from you. Hear me. Within 200 Earth years, when men tire of your silence and arrive here, we will be ready for them, because you will teach us everything you know. We will become a highly civilized people, and we shall prevent the human race from ever setting foot on our land. And the prophecy? We knew neither prophets nor saviors. Come. The group of prisoners was led to the observation window. Thousands of doomies, ferocious shadows moving under the polychromatic light of the moons, surrounded the tiara. Many were coming inside through the open hatches. Captain, Rossi said, haltingly, when Nasakov hit me, I was trying to warn you about something. What? According to biblical tradition, the redemption, because of its divine origin, cannot be prevented by anyone. The great nova, descending now and darkened by the moons, glittered faintly across the desert. Introduction to Stunt Mind by Braulio Tavares, written 1989, translated by the author. Braulio Tavares was born in 1950 in Campina Grande, in the northeast of Brazil, and has resided in Rio de Janeiro since 1982. His work has been chiefly in the creative arts. In Brazil, he is recognized as a singer-songwriter of what he calls oral literature or folk poetry. He is a 1991 Clarion graduate and a member of the Science Fiction Research Association. Tavares' nonfiction work on SF includes the Fantastic, Fantasy, and Science Fiction Literature Catalog, an English-language bibliography of Brazilian fantastic literature, 1992, and articles in the Nichols and Clute Encyclopedia of Science Fiction, 1993, in Clute and Grant's Encyclopedia of Fantasy, 1997, and in publications such as Foundation and the New York Review of Science Fiction. He has published one SF novel, The Flying Machine, 1994, and two story collections, The Backbone of Memory, 1989, and Ghost World, 1996. The Backbone of Memory received 3 Nova Awards. Stunt Mind was first published in Portuguese in The Backbone of Memory and was later translated into English by the author for publication in the Canadian magazine On Spec, autumn 1994. For those who might have missed it then, we offer it here and invite you to experience Tavares' hypnotic vision of interspecies contact between humans and a powerful race of aliens called the Outsiders. What the alien race craves is what humans take for granted and even despise about themselves: their feelings. Stunt Mind. At the opposite end of the large marble room, a photo of Roger Van Dali covers the entire wall. I'm sitting in my sliding chair, and I press the keys, making it glide toward that enormous face, the face of Van Dali. I don't remember when this photo was taken. All I recall is that it was before his mission. He wears a gray suit with a black tie. He has a thin face, short hair, thick eyebrows. Deep lines run down both sides of his mouth. He's looking at an indefinite point to the left of the camera and doesn't seem to acknowledge its presence. He seems unaware of everything. He just stares into the void. I call this room the art gallery. It contains nothing but this 25 square meter photo. I come here every day before breakfast. I look at this photo and I think about me. I go downstairs. Van Dali's servants are busy around the table, preparing a meal with tropical fruits. In the afternoon, if the weather is good, I will take the helicopter and go to the canyon to see the sunset. I haven't been out of this house for 6 months. It rained, and I could not go to the canyon. I went to the basement instead, put on a mask, dived into the tank, harpooned some fish. It was 10 p.m. when I went upstairs and dressed for dinner. My guests talked about the incredibly bizarre kidnappings that have been taking place in several countries. It's not a matter of mere politics anymore. Those groups claim to have created a new form of art. The first hostages were tattooed before being released, but now a group in Venezuela has introduced the procedure of peeling the skin off their faces. Stanzarelli, one of the guests, one who always closes his eyes while speaking, said that anesthesia is a kind of ersatz blindness, and then he smiled. We all smiled, and I ordered the waiters to serve the honey wine. After dinner, we went upstairs to the Oval Room. I showed them my collection of cuneiform tablets. I had hired some translators for the night, and we read and discussed the texts until dawn. Naskacha and her geishas were the last ones to leave. I went to my bedroom, read a little, and then spent some time not reading, just retracing the beautiful shapes of the letters with my eyes, and I slid smoothly into an imageless sleep. Roger Van Dali never slept well. Since his childhood, he had never slept more than 3 hours at a time. As he grew up, he realized that he was not like other boys, and his family used to see him as a predestinate, as so many families do. He was 32 and had been working as a bookkeeper when he was discovered and drafted for the Contact mission. During his training, with dozens of physicians around him, he asked what he was supposed to do. "Someone will say something in your mind," they answered. "You will hear, and then you will tell us what it was." It was during the Van Dali mission that the press coined the name that would be applied to his group from then on. Stunt minds was the label given to the people whose minds were, for some random genetic reason, suitable for mental contact with the outsiders. Millions of government agents combed the world in search of potential stunt minds. Whenever one was found, he was enrolled, trained, and taken in a space shuttle to the orbital station, where an outsider scout ship submitted him to another series of tests. Some were turned back without explanation. Those approved were taken to the main outsider ship and put in mind contact with the outsiders by a process whose details were kept secret by the aliens. For some period of time, minutes, hours, days, the minds of the Earthling and the alien vibrated and pulsed together, becoming a whole. Then they were separated again, and the man was taken back to the station. When Vandali returned to Earth, he was physically devastated, weighing 20 pounds less than he had 2 weeks earlier, when he had shaken hands with 9 presidents as he prepared to enter the shuttle. Stunt minds returned to Earth no more than zombies, but prolific zombies nonetheless. They created and developed the most eccentric mathematical formulae in insane bursts of activity, and they wrote things without an inkling of understanding. When their information was exhausted, they were officially retired, mentally ill, their minds half crippled by what scientists called the Kingsley-Vicart effect, an overload of information. Their mission fulfilled, they withdrew from the world to spend their last years like sheikhs, like maharajas, like mandarins in mansions with 99 rooms, like this one of mine. Today was Scarab Day. I undressed and, in an enormous marble basin, had my legs and arms tied, and then had the scarabs spread over me. They seemed to have millions of tiny feet, and they acted as though they knew what I was feeling. Then I slept. In the afternoon, I saddled a pony and rode through the woods on the ground floor. In this house, I have bedrooms. I have swimming rooms. I have rooms full of perfumed smoke, rooms full of children's toys, rooms full of books, rooms full of fish bowls. I have dozens of rooms whose furniture recreates other times and other places. I have the dark crypt where Aleister Crowley performed his rituals. I have the room where Paris loved Helen of Troy, and also Messalina's sultry alcove, and the huge canopy bed of Christine, Queen of Sweden. I have the room where Marilyn Monroe died, and in that room lives a professional Marilyn double, almost a clone. I have Turkish seraglios, dungeons and cloister cells, rooms from brothels in Nazi Berlin and in Muslim Andalusia. When I feel lonely, I warn my servants, and half an hour later I open a door and enter the chosen scene. It's not every day that it happens. It's more during winter, when fierce storms are raging outside, and I try to forget them. Today is Tuesday, and I had to welcome Vandali's biographers. Since it is winter, only 2 of them appeared. When they arrived, I was playing tennis against Ivanov and Leroux, my nurses. Sometimes I imagine that I could play several simultaneous tennis games, as chess players do. A semicircular court, me against 4, or 5. I think about this while I take a shower and choose my clothes. Last Tuesday I wore an artillery uniform, a gift from Pablo Mijerinos, a recent stunt mind with long purple hair. Today I choose a tuxedo and a top hat in bright colors. I feel talkative. I go downstairs to the library and greet the biographers, whose names I always forget. The blonde woman has a quaint accent, and she asks me about the usefulness of a stunt mind to the world. Patiently I repeat, "We receive a gleam, and we have the duty of transmitting its reflex." The man who dresses in white asks me how I would describe the mental feeling of the contact. I describe it as that of a geometrical point that is compelled to receive a polygon inside itself. We are useless parasites of mankind. This is what is written in the newspapers financed by the opposition companies. And maybe we are. The multi-state companies spend more and more money on stunt mines every year because every contact, every message demands a new, untouched brain. It is said that our Xanadus insult the poverty of the world's billions of people, but the countries of Earth needed us. They needed the messages that our crippled minds brought home, and so it is only fair that now we have our city far away from other cities, a city just for us, where each month a new house is built. A pagoda, a marble honeycomb, a tower made of Brazilian redwood, a mansion in the shape of a word, an upside-down castle. Here we are, the parasites and the Illuminati, the men and women who gave their minds to be raped by equations, by alien formulae, by data that Earth scientists receive with eagerness and examine with wonder, something for which a scholar would give half his life, and which billions of people pay homage to but don't understand. I live in Vandali's mansion. To the outsiders, the person of Vandali didn't exist, or, like an electron, could not be told apart from the others. His mind was only a chip, a stone on which a message was carved. When Vandali came back to Earth, he carried in his mind the blueprints of the topological structure of the interwoven universes. It was only after this that the nations of Earth could master the projection of physical objects in hypertime and start to build the gate. It is winter, but I am repeating myself. I wake up at noon, and even before opening my eyes, I turn on the hypnoscope, then stare at the small silvery sphere as it revolves a few inches before my eyes. Entranced, I restore some minutes of my dreams, minutes that otherwise would melt away under the ruthless touch of reality. I turn it off and go to the gym. Afterward, I have breakfast, then go to the hothouse, take a box full of insects, and feed my plants. I make sure that they have everything: water, electrosun, fresh air. I talk to them, touched by the way they respond, gently waving their leaves. At 3 p.m., I go to the indigo room on the 4th floor, call for a philatrix, stay with her a long time. Then I go downstairs, have a bath, do my checkup, my acupuncture. It is still raining. I cannot see the sunset in the canyon. I go to the library instead and spend hours leafing through picture books. At 8, I am called to dinner: shrimp with cream cheese and sweet garlic, and a salad of synths. After finishing, I order the coffee in the black and silver room, together with a ballet, the Pas de Deux from Smolyakin's Tristram and Juliet, with choreography by Nomura. Back in the library, I sit at my computer and exchange correspondence for a few hours after choosing a group of programs at random: De Assis, De Camp, De Quincy, De Sade. A servant appears and announces the arrival of guests. I remember I invited some people to a bagpipe concert at midnight. Downstairs is a small group, 3 stunt mines from the neighborhood and 5 visiting earthlings, as we call them. 2 of them are first-time visitors to Vandali's house. They take my hand as if I were a king, as if I were an octopus. One more day, like any other. Now I am naked. My body floats inside a huge vertical glass cylinder. The jets of hot air keep me hovering, almost weightless, revolving around myself inside the circle of tanning lights. In my ears, phones with docu-music, the sounds of the rescue of a Spanish galleon from the 17th century near the Cape of Good Hope. The hot air is so good. It is 14 minutes past 11 on a winter night, outside. I once jumped into an enormous chocolate pie. I sank like a bullet in wood. I swam. I ate. I found my way out. I've been tied to the propeller of a plane and had the engine turned on. I have drunk everything: brine, urine, semen, pepper juice, amniotic fluid, hydrochloric acid, menstrual blood, aqua tofana, hyperdistilled water. I have fought rattlesnakes with my teeth, with my hands tied behind my back. I have jumped from a plane at 6,000 feet, tied to an elastic cord. I have been entombed for 6 days and 6 nights. Today, the rain stopped. I called my helicopter and flew to the canyon. I sat on a rock and stared at the sun. I saw how it melted in wild colors, and tears rolled down my face till the world was dark. Back home, I went through cypress glades. I passed along it very slowly, my chair gliding softly upon the air spheres, my closed eyes preserving that trembling shadow of the sun. The air around me was resounding with the music of the thousands of bells that hung from the trees, golden bells, silver bells, crystal bells tinkling at the cold winds blowing. I felt that I was vibrating and pulsating in sympathy with their sound. In moments like this, I remember the contact. I remember that moment in which I, Roger Vandali, felt all the vast loneliness of the outsider. Yes, I still think of them as individuals, as units of consciousness or psi quanta. I remember that instant in which I became me and him. In that moment, my frail human mind touched his memories of travels through hypertime, recoiling at what I found there. I think the same thing happens with all stunt minds, but I've never asked anyone about it. We're a guild of silent people. And I awoke in Vandali's body after the contact, like one who emerges from a throbbing abyss. I came to Earth and was given this face of mine. They taught me my name, told me my life, gave me a mountain of money, and then forgot me. And now, here we are. I and I. I can say I am embedded in Vandali's mind. Also, I can say a part of the outsider is inside me and now lives in this world where it indulges itself in every excess, in every curiosity. We can thank the outsiders for the keys to hypertime and for opening the doors of the universe for us, but I don't think they came to escort us across the galaxies. What they want is to live here and to be like us. The taste for human feelings is their vice. In exchange for this caprice, for this desertion, they give us their theorems and send us into space. I cannot understand this human greediness for space, since the abyss is only the abyss, and nowhere is there a planet so full of perverse beauty as this world of yours.